Clara Whitmore hit her knees in the dirt before she even realized she'd fallen. Her hands slammed into the ground, palms shredding against the gravel, and the sound that tore out of her throat wasn't a scream. It was something worse, something broken. The wagon wheel had split clean off the axle, and the whole rig had lurched sideways and thrown her forward, and now she knelt there in the dust of a mountain trail that didn't appear on any map she'd been given. One hand pressed to her belly, the other bleeding into the dirt, and the only thing she could hear was the wind coming down off the Bitterroot Mountains, like God himself had decided this was the day she would finally give up. She wasn't going to give up, but she was very, very close. Before we go any further into Clara's story, if this kind of tale speaks to your heart, I want you to take just a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. Hit that subscribe button, ring that notification bell, and drop a comment below, telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Your support means everything, and I promise you, what happens next to Clara Whitmore is something you do not want to miss. Now let's go back to that mountain trail in Montana, 1881, and find out what kind of man would stop for a woman the rest of the world had already left behind. Montana Territory had been punishing that summer in a way that felt almost personal. The rivers had dropped so low, you could see the riverbeds that hadn't seen sunlight in a decade. The grass along the lower trails had gone yellow and brittle, and the mountain passes that were supposed to be manageable by July had turned treacherous with loose rock and dried-out soil that gave way without warning. Every experienced traveler in the territory knew what that summer meant. It meant you didn't take chances. It meant you stayed close to settlements. It meant you did not travel alone. Clara Whitmore had no choice but to travel alone. She was 31 years old, 8.5 months along in her pregnancy, and she had been on the road for 19 days. Her husband Samuel had been dead for 4 months. The money he'd left her had lasted 3. The house they'd shared in Billings had been taken by the bank 2 weeks after that, because Samuel, God rest him, had been a man of principle and detailed record-keeping, but a poor judge of what happened to a woman's finances when the man who managed them was suddenly in the ground. Clara had sold what she could. She'd packed what remained into a wagon she'd bought second-hand from a harness maker who'd charged her twice what it was worth, and smiled at her while he did it. She'd pointed herself northwest toward her sister Margaret's homestead near Missoula, and told herself it was only 300 miles, and she was strong, and the baby wasn't due for another month at least, and she would be absolutely fine. She was not fine. The wagon wheel that cracked apart on the trail above the Gallatin Valley hadn't given her any warning. One moment she was moving slow and careful, guiding her tired mare around a bend in the trail where the road narrowed between 2 granite outcroppings. The next moment there was a sound like a rifle shot, and the left rear wheel folded under the wagon like a broken leg, and the whole rig pitched sideways and sent her sprawling forward across the bench seat and then down into the gravel below. She lay there for a moment without moving. The baby kicked. "I know," Clara said to her belly. I know. Give me a minute." She got to her hands and knees. She assessed the damage. She was a practical woman. Samuel had always said that about her, sometimes as a compliment, and sometimes with a slightly frustrated edge, depending on whether her practicality was agreeing with him or pointing out that he was wrong. The wheel was destroyed. The axle looked bent. Her mare Bessie was standing with her head low and her legs trembling, and Clara recognized that look. It was the look of an animal that had given everything it had and had nothing remaining. "That's all right, sweet girl," Clara said. She stood slowly, one hand pressed to the small of her back, where a dull, constant ache had taken up permanent residence about 6 weeks ago. "That's all right." She looked up the trail. Empty. She looked back down the trail. Empty. She looked at the mountains rising on either side of her, vast and indifferent and extraordinary, and she thought about Samuel, and she thought about the wooden chest bolted to the floor of the wagon bed, and she thought about what he'd said to her the night before he died. "Make sure the truth reaches someone who can stop him, Clara. Promise me." She'd promised him. She was going to keep that promise, even if it killed her. Which, standing on this broken trail with a ruined wagon and a spent horse and a baby pressing against her ribs from the inside, felt like a genuine possibility. She started going through her options. She could unhitch Bessie and try to ride her, but Bessie was a draft animal and hadn't been ridden in years, and Clara, in her current condition, could not safely mount a horse. She could leave the wagon and walk, but the nearest settlement was 12 miles back the way she'd come, and she would not make it before dark, and she could not leave the chest. She could stay with the wagon and hope that someone came along this trail, but she had not seen another traveler in 2 days, and the sky to the northwest had the particular gray-yellow color that meant a summer storm was building in the mountains. She sat down on the edge of the wagon bed, pressed both hands to her belly, and did something she rarely allowed herself to do. She cried, not from self-pity. Clara Whitmore had very little patience for self-pity, even directed at herself. She cried because she was exhausted and frightened, and because the person she would normally have turned to when things got this bad was 4 months in the ground in Billings, and she missed him so much it felt like a physical wound that hadn't closed, and here she was on a mountain trail with his secret locked in a chest and his baby pushing against her ribs, and she was so tired. She was so tired. She let herself cry for exactly 3 minutes. She had learned that trick during the first terrible weeks after Samuel died, that grief didn't stop. If you tried to hold it back, it just went underground and came out sideways at worse moments. 3 minutes. Cry hard and completely. Then stop. Then keep moving. She was on her second minute when she heard the horse. Nathan Cole heard the woman before he saw her. He was coming down the switchback trail from the upper ridge, heading back toward his ranch, after checking on a section of his fence line that kept collapsing near the northern boundary. He was not in a hurry. He was never in a hurry anymore. Hurrying suggested you were eager to get somewhere, and Nathan Cole had not been eager to get anywhere in going on 3 years now. He was 38 years old and looked 45, not because he had lived badly, but because he had worked hard and grieved hard, and the Montana sun didn't ask permission before it wrote its story on a man's face. He was broad through the shoulders and long in the leg, and he wore his silence the way other men wore a coat, like something he'd put on one morning and never taken off again. His horse, a gray quarter horse named Gideon, was the most reliable creature in his life, and Nathan liked him specifically because Gideon did not talk, did not need reassurance, and did not expect Nathan to be anything other than what he was. What Nathan was a man who had learned not to want things. He had been a different man once. He had been the kind of man who whistled while he worked and brought wildflowers back from the upper pasture for his wife and taught his son to bait a hook with the particular focused seriousness of a father who believed this was important information for a boy to have. He had been a man with a full house and a full life, and then one winter night on the road between his ranch and town, a wagon axle had snapped on a patch of black ice, and the wagon had rolled, and he had crawled out of the wreckage, and his wife and his son had not. He did not think about that night if he could help it. He had gotten very good at not thinking about things he couldn't change. Gideon stopped. He hadn't touched the reins. Gideon had simply stopped, ears forward, head up, nostrils flaring. Nathan trusted Gideon's instincts more than he trusted most human beings, so he sat quietly and listened. A woman's voice, soft and ragged like something being torn. He sat there for a moment. He was aware of what he was doing. He was deciding. He had made this decision before in the months after he'd built his isolation into something permanent, had ridden past a family with a lame horse, had seen a man struggling alone with a loaded pack mule on a bad trail, and had kept moving. Not from cruelty, from a kind of self-preservation that had calcified over time into habit. Getting involved meant caring. Caring meant having something to lose. He already knew exactly how that ended. He touched his heel to Gideon's flank, and the horse moved forward around the bend in the trail, and Nathan saw her. She was on her knees beside a collapsed wagon, one hand flat against the ground, one hand pressed to her belly, and she was crying in the concentrated, deliberate way of someone who knew they couldn't afford to cry for long. Her brown hair had come entirely loose from whatever pins had been holding it and fell across her face and her shoulders. Her dress was the color it had once been blue before the trail dust had gotten to it. She was clearly pregnant, obviously heavily pregnant, and she was clearly exhausted, and clearly bleeding from her palms, and clearly completely alone. Nathan sat on Gideon for a moment and did not move. The woman hadn't heard them approach over the sound of the wind. Her head was down, her shoulders were shaking. Something happened in Nathan Cole's chest that he did not have a ready name for. It wasn't pity. He'd felt pity before, and this wasn't it. It was something older and heavier than pity, something that recognized itself. He dismounted. He was quiet about it. Gideon stood still, and Nathan's boots hit the gravel without much sound. But the woman heard him anyway, or perhaps she sensed the change in the air, and her head came up fast, and she was on her feet, faster than seemed physically possible for someone in her condition, spinning to face him, with her back pressed against the wagon and her chin up and her bleeding hands balled into fists at her sides. Nathan stopped. He was still 8 feet away from her. He could see her eyes now, brown like her hair. Red-rimmed from crying but steady. Frightened, yes, but the fear was something she was managing, not something that was managing her. He took his hat off. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm not going to hurt you." She stared at him, took in the gun belt, the rifle on Gideon's saddle, the size of him. "I've heard that before," she said. Her voice was steadier than he expected. "I reckon you have," Nathan said. "And I reckon the men who said it didn't always mean it. I mean it." A silence. The wind came down off the mountains between them. "Your wheel's gone," Nathan said, because stating the obvious sometimes gave frightened people something to hold on to. Solid facts. Things that could be agreed upon. "I noticed that," Clara said. "The smallest edge. Not quite sharp enough to be rude, but present." He almost smiled. Almost. "Your horse is spent." "I noticed that too." "Storm coming in from the northwest. 3 hours, maybe 4. She glanced at the sky. Something moved across her face. She'd already calculated this, he could tell. She'd already run through her options and didn't like any of them. And this fact, the fact that she had already tried to solve this before allowing herself to fall apart, made him revise his estimate of her upward considerably. "Is there a settlement nearby?" she asked. 12 miles back toward Bozeman. 6 miles ahead there's a way station, but it's been abandoned since spring." "What's past the way station?" "Another 8 miles, and you'd reach my ranch." She looked at him. He looked at her. "There's no one else on this trail today," Nathan said. "I know because I came down from the ridge and I can see about 4 miles of it from up there. You're it." Clara's jaw tightened. He watched her do what she'd clearly been doing this entire trip, take a situation she couldn't control and look for the piece of it she could work with. "How do I know you're not the kind of man who helps a woman in trouble so he can create more trouble for her?" It was a fair question. He didn't flinch from it. "You don't?" he said. "Not for certain. But I'll tell you what I can offer you. I'll tell you my name. I'll tell you where my ranch is and who can confirm I live there. I'll tell you that if you come with me, you'll have a roof and a bed and food. And if you'd rather I go back to the way station and see if there's anything there that can shelter you for the night, I can do that too, and leave you to make your own choices." "But ma'am," he glanced at the sky again. "That storm's not going to wait for you to feel comfortable." Clara stared at him for a long moment. "What's your name?" she said. "Nathan Cole." "Nathan Cole." She repeated it like she was filing it somewhere in her memory. "I'm Clara Whitmore. Mrs. Whitmore. My husband is dead." The words were flat and practiced. She'd said them enough times that they had worn smooth at the edges. "It's just Clara." "Clara, then." Another silence. The mare Bessie shifted her weight and sighed heavily. "There are things in this wagon I cannot leave behind," Clara said. "Not any of them. Particularly not a chest that's bolted to the floor of the bed. All right? I mean it. The chest comes, or I don't." "I understood you," Nathan said. "I've got rope, and I've got Gideon, and if you help me figure out what needs saving from the rest, we can rig something." She looked at him for another long moment. Really looked at him the way people don't usually look at strangers, like she was trying to read something written behind his eyes. Whatever she found there, it seemed to satisfy her. "I'm not helpless," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm 8.5 months along, and I've been on the road for 19 days, and my wagon is broken, and I can't ride a horse right now. But that doesn't make me helpless. "No, ma'am," Nathan said. "I can see that plain enough." She let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the same family. "All right, Mr. Cole," she said. "Tell me how we do this." It took them the better part of an hour. Nathan unslung the rope from Gideon's saddle and fashioned a drag sling for the chest, a solid thing iron-banded oak, and heavy enough that it took both of them to shift it. He noticed the way Clara positioned herself to help the way she moved with the careful deliberateness of a woman who knew her own body's limitations and worked within them rather than pretending they didn't exist. She didn't apologize for being slow. She didn't make excuses. She simply did what she could do and let him do what she couldn't. And there was a dignity in that he hadn't expected. He noticed other things, too. The wagon bed held more than just the chest. There was a carefully wrapped bundle of books, heavy, the leather on them cracked, but the pages protected. There was a surveyor's kit, the kind of precision equipment that cost real money, with a brass transit and measuring rods and a logbook that had been wrapped in oilskin against the weather. There was a carpet bag of clothing and a small tin box that made a soft rattling sound that might have been medicine bottles. "Surveying tools," he said more to himself than to her. "My husband's," Clara said from beside him. She had both hands on one side of the chest and her feet planted. "Samuel was a land surveyor." "Good work, that." It was. He was very good at it. Past tense, clean and deliberate. "Some of his instruments need to stay with the chest. They're important." Nathan wrapped the instruments in a canvas tarp and secured them beside the chest. He loaded the books onto Gideon's back and the carpet bag after them. The tin medicine box went into his saddlebag without comment. Clara watched him pack each thing with the focused attention of someone cataloging every decision being made about her belongings, and he respected it. "What about Bessie?" Clara asked when they'd gotten most of it sorted. Nathan looked at the mare. Bessie looked back at him with large, exhausted eyes. "She can walk," he said. "Slowly. She'll be all right if we take it easy." "She's been very good," Clara said quietly. "She got me 19 days. That's a good horse." "She's the best horse. I just—" She stopped. Something shifted in her face. "I just need her to get me a little further." Nathan tied Bessie's lead to Gideon's saddle ring and helped Clara up onto Gideon's back. It was a careful business getting her situated, and she was crimson with the effort of accepting help with it, and not saying anything about that difficulty, and he handed her the reins and stepped back. "You ride?" he asked. "I grew up on a farm in Ohio," she said. "I've ridden since before I could read." "Good. Gideon'll follow my lead. You just hold on." They moved out at a walk, Nathan leading on foot, which meant he had nothing to do but think, and thinking was something he'd spent 3 years specifically trying to avoid. He thought about it anyway. He thought about the way she'd come up off the ground with her fists ready. He thought about the surveying equipment and the iron-banded chest and the way she'd said it, "The chest comes," or "I don't like." She'd already made peace with a number of unacceptable outcomes, but this particular one was not negotiable. He thought about a woman 8.5 months pregnant, 19 days on the road from Billings heading northwest. Alone. "How far is Missoula from where we are?" Clara asked from behind him. "Long way yet," he said. "Maybe 140 miles. She was quiet for a moment. "I'll need to find a way to refit in Bozeman, or hire someone to drive me the rest of the way, or—" She paused. "I'll figure something out." "You could rest first," Nathan said. "Wherever you end up." "I can't rest. I've got somewhere to be." "You're 8.5 months along." "I'm aware of that. That baby doesn't know about your schedule." He heard something that might have been a laugh cut short. "No," she said. "No, the baby is very much on her own schedule. Or his. I don't know yet." "Your first?" A beat. Slightly too long. "No," Clara said. "My second." He didn't ask. Something in the brevity of it told him not to ask. They walked in silence for a while. The trail descended through a stand of pines, the air cool and resinous, the light going golden and horizontal through the trees. Nathan watched the trail ahead of them and felt the particular strangeness of having someone else's breathing in his awareness again, the soft rhythm of another person nearby. He'd forgotten what it was like. Not entirely, but enough that it felt strange now, like a language he used to speak. "Mr. Cole," Clara said. "Nathan. Nathan." A slight pause, like she was trying the word for size. "Why did you stop?" He thought about that. "Gideon stopped first," he said. "That's not what I asked." He thought about it some more. "I don't know," he said finally, which was the most honest answer he had. "I haven't stopped for anyone in a good while. Gideon stopped, and I looked at you, and I stopped thinking about the other choice." She seemed to consider this. "The other choice being to keep writing." "Yes, but you're the kind of man who usually keeps writing." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't quite an accusation. It was simply a recognition, the kind that comes from someone who has been paying attention. "I was," Nathan said. "For a while." What changed? He didn't answer that. He wasn't sure he could answer it. He wasn't even sure he understood it himself. Something about the way she'd been on her knees in the gravel with her hands balled into fists, still fighting, already planning. Something about a woman who was clearly at the end of something and still hadn't let go. He'd recognize that from the inside was the thing. By the time Nathan's ranch came into view through the tree line, the sky to the northwest had gone the color of a bruise, and the first breath of storm-cold air was moving through the pines. Gideon picked up his pace slightly, knowing home, and Bessie's ears came forward for the first time in hours. Clara had been quiet for the last 2 miles. Not the brittle quiet of someone trying not to cry, but the more settled quiet of someone who was simply exhausted past the point of conversation. Nathan had glanced back at her twice, and both times she'd been sitting straight, both hands on the reins, eyes forward. Stubborn and upright to the last. The ranch was nothing remarkable from the outside. A main house, solid but plain. A barn that was in better repair than the house because Nathan had always taken better care of his animals than himself. A corral with 3 horses that came to the fence rail as they approached. A well with a new rope pulley that creaked in the rising wind. He brought Gideon to a stop beside the barn and reached up to help Clara dismount. She came down slowly, testing each step, and when her feet hit the ground, she stood still for a moment with one hand on Gideon's flank and her eyes closed. "You all right?" Nathan asked. "I will be," she said. "Just give me a moment." He gave her the moment. "Inside's clean," he said when she opened her eyes. "It's not much, but there's a room off the back that stays warm and there's a bed in it that's made up. The kitchen's got dried stores and I can get a fire going. There's a water pump at the back of the house." Clara looked at the house. Then she looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "Asked me that already." "I know. I'm asking again." He picked up Bessie's lead and walked toward the barn, and she fell into step beside him, and he said, "Because there wasn't a good reason not to." She made a sound at that, quiet and complicated. "My husband used to say," she said, "that the absence of a good reason not to do something wasn't the same as a reason to do it." Smart man. He was. She was quiet for a step or two. He also said that the people who waited for good reasons before doing the right thing usually waited too long. Nathan looked at her sideways. "That sounds like a contradiction," he said. "It does," Clara agreed. He was a man of complicated opinions. He thought a lot about things. She glanced toward the wagon bed where the chest rode strapped behind them. He wrote most of them down. There was something in the way she said it. Not grief exactly, though the grief was there underneath. Something more immediate. Something that put a small, careful tension into the set of her shoulders. Nathan noticed it and filed it away. He got Bessie settled in a stall with water and a measure of oats that the mare went after with the focused intensity of an animal who had been underfed for too long. Gideon went into his own stall and stood quietly regarding the proceedings with the philosophical patience that Nathan had always loved about him. "What's in the chest?" Nathan asked. He said it simply without preamble while he was uncinching Gideon's saddle, not looking at her, giving her room. Clara's hands, which had been smoothing Bessie's nose, went still. "What makes you think there's something in it?" she said carefully. "Because you said you couldn't leave it behind, and you meant it in a way that was about more than sentiment," Nathan said. "And because it's got bolt holes through the floor of your wagon bed, someone secured it careful. And because you looked at it twice on the trail here like you were making sure it was still there." A long silence. "You don't miss much," Clara said. "I learned not to." She turned away from Bessie's stall and stood in the center of the barn, and for the first time since he'd found her on the trail, the composure she wore like armor showed something underneath. Not weakness. Not quite. Something older and heavier. "My husband was a land surveyor," she said slowly. "I told you that. What I didn't tell you is that the last job he took before he got sick before he died was a survey commission in the lower Gallatin Valley, mapping land claims for a land development company." Nathan turned to look at her. "During that survey," Clara continued, "Samuel found something wrong. The boundary markers on several of the claims had been moved, not by erosion or settlement deliberately moved in the dark, by people who knew exactly what they were doing and why. The land being sold to incoming settlers wasn't the land those settlers thought they were buying." "Someone was selling land they didn't own," Nathan said. "Worse than that. Someone was selling land that already had legal owners, poor families, homesteaders, some of them been on that land for years. The forged documents looked real. The county records had been altered. The settlers buying in had no idea, and the families being pushed off." She stopped. "Some of them had nowhere else to go." Nathan was still. The barn was quiet except for the horses. "Samuel collected everything he could find," Clara said. "Every piece of evidence. Maps showing where the markers had been moved. Survey records showing the discrepancy between what the company was selling and what was legally owned. Copies of the forged documents alongside the originals. He put it all in that chest, and he brought it home, and he said, 'I know who's behind this. I know who's profiting from it. And if I take this to the authorities, he's going to know it was me.'" "Who?" Nathan said. "A man named Victor Blackwell." She said the name like a stone dropping into water. "He's got money, and he's got connections, and he's got people who do what he tells them to do without asking why. Samuel was going to take the evidence to a federal marshal in Helena, but he got sick before he could make the trip. And then he got sicker. And then—" she lifted her chin slightly. "Then he made me promise." Nathan thought about the broken wagon wheel. He thought about a well-traveled woman who'd handled 19 days on the road alone, making an amateur error on a trail that wasn't particularly difficult. "Your wheel," he said. "You said it broke on a straight section." Clara looked at him steadily. "The axle pin was missing," she said. "I noticed it after I fell. It was a split pin fastening. You'd need tools to remove it. It doesn't come out on its own." "You think someone tampered with it?" "I know someone tampered with it." Her voice didn't shake. "Someone who knew where I was going and what I was carrying, and had enough lead on me to get ahead of me and pull a pin from my axle and count on the fact that a pregnant woman alone on a mountain trail in summer heat might not survive what happened next." The storm broke through the pines beyond the barn wall, thunder deep and rolling, the sound of it moving across the mountains like something enormous shifting in its sleep. Nathan stood in the middle of his barn that had been silent for 3 years and looked at a woman who was 8.5 months pregnant, who was bleeding from her palms, who was carrying a dead man's evidence against a powerful man, in a chest bolted to the floor of a broken wagon, who had made a promise to a husband she'd buried in the spring and was going to keep it if it was the last thing she did. She was looking back at him, waiting, not for him to solve her problem, not for him to tell her it was going to be all right, just waiting to see what kind of man he was, the way she'd been watching and waiting since the moment he'd taken off his hat on the trail. "You're going to need to rest tonight," Nathan said. Clara blinked. That wasn't what she'd expected him to say. "I know," she said. "Tomorrow we can talk about what comes next." "All right, but tonight you eat something and you sleep," he said. "Everything else waits." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then something shifted in her face. Not softness exactly, but a kind of release, like a fist opening. "All right," she said again. quieter. He picked up a lantern and led the way out of the barn across the yard toward the house, the first rain beginning to come down hard and cold around them. And Clara Whitmore walked beside him with the chest on its drag sled, coming behind them, and the whole weight of her dead husband's promise on her shoulders, and she did not once ask him to slow down. Inside, he got the kitchen fire going. The rain came down in earnest now, drumming on the roof, and the house, which had been cold and quiet for so long, filled with the sounds of the storm and the crackle of the fire and the movement of another person in the space. He put beans on to heat and sliced the last of a dried sausage he'd been meaning to use, and set out bread from 2 days ago, still good, and put the coffee on because she looked like a woman who needed coffee, even if it wasn't what the book said. Clara sat at the kitchen table and looked around the room. He watched her taking it in the clean surfaces, the carefully stacked firewood, the shelves of provisions lined up with the quiet precision of a man who had organized his world down to the last detail, because when you lived alone, the external order was the only kind you could guarantee. "You keep a clean house," she said. "Only way I know how to do it," Nathan said. "You live alone." "Yes." "How long?" He set a bowl of beans in front of her and sat down across the table. 3 years, he said. She looked at the empty chairs. At the second place setting, he'd put down automatically, and then almost removed and then left because removing it felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. "What happened?" she said. He didn't answer right away. She picked up her spoon and started eating, and she had the grace not to push it, and he found himself talking anyway. "I had a wife and a son," he said. "I don't talk about them because talking about them doesn't change what happened. But they were real, and they were mine, and they were good. And a winter night 3 years ago took them from me on the road between here and Bozeman." Clara set her spoon down. "I'm sorry," she said. And then, "I mean that simply, not as a thing to say. I mean it." "I know you do," Nathan said. "How old was your son?" 7. She was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face that he couldn't read. "I had a daughter," she said. 2 years ago. She didn't..." A breath. "She was born still. I don't talk about it either usually, but it seems fair since you told me yours." He looked at her. She picked up her spoon again and went back to the beans, and he understood exactly what she was doing and why. Because he'd done the same thing himself more times than he could count. Keep your hands busy. Keep moving forward. Let the fact sit there between you without trying to make it mean anything, because sometimes things just happened and there was no meaning to find, and the only thing to do was keep eating your beans. "The chest will be safe here tonight," Nathan said. Clara looked up. "Yes," she said. "I believe it will." Outside, the storm moved through the mountains, and Nathan Cole sat in his kitchen across the table from Clara Whitmore, and the fire burned and the rain came down, and somewhere between the silence and the sound of another person breathing in his house, something shifted in him. Not love. Not yet. Too soon for that, and too raw and too complicated by too much of everything that had come before. But something. The smallest, most terrifying thing. A door he'd nailed shut 3 years ago in the dark with both hands. It had moved, just a fraction, just enough to let in light. Clara woke before dawn. She lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar room, listening to the rain that had softened overnight from a hard drumming to a quiet, persistent murmur against the roof. The mattress was old, but clean. Someone had left a folded quilt at the foot of the bed, and at some point in the night she had pulled it over herself without remembering doing it. The room smelled like cedar, and something else, wood smoke maybe, and the particular dry smell of a house that had been aired out with discipline rather than warmth. She pressed her palm to her belly. The baby was still. Not the alarming stillness that could mean something wrong, but the deep, settled stillness of a child asleep inside her, which Clara had learned to distinguish from the other kind through long, careful attention. She breathed out slowly. "Still here," she said quietly. "Good girl. Or boy. Whoever you are. Good." She got herself upright with the careful, effortful process that had become her morning routine these last 2 months, rolling to her side first, pushing up from the elbow, sitting on the edge of the bed while her back rearranged its complaints in order of urgency. Her palms were stiff where she'd scraped them on the gravel. Someone had cleaned and wrapped them last night. She remembered that vaguely, Nathan's hands, steady and businesslike with the cloth and the salve, not asking permission, but not being rough about it either. The wrapping was neat, tighter than she would have done herself. She stood. She went to the window. The ranch yard was quiet in the pre-dawn gray. The barn doors were open, which meant Nathan was already up and already working, which did not surprise her. She had recognized something in him the night before, between the clean kitchen and the silence, and the way he'd talked about his wife and son, that flat factual delivery. That meant the grief was real and old, and had been survived rather than resolved. She knew that delivery because she used it herself. She found her dress, straightened it, and went to the kitchen. Nathan was at the stove when she came in, and he looked up once briefly, and then looked back at what he was doing, which was cracking eggs into a pan with the efficiency of someone who cooked alone and had streamlined the process down to its essential movements. "Coffee's on," he said. "Thank you." She poured herself a cup and sat down at the table, and he put a plate in front of her, without ceremony, eggs and a piece of bread and a small portion of dried apple that he'd clearly rehydrated from stores, and sat down across from her with his own plate. And they ate in the kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but was full of things neither of them had said yet. "I need to get to Helena," Clara said when she'd gotten through half the eggs. Nathan looked up. "I know you said to rest," she said quickly. "And I slept. I rested. But the chest, everything Samuel collected, it needs to go to a federal marshal, and it needs to go soon. Because if Blackwell's men tampered with my wagon axle, they know roughly where I am, and every day I stay in one place." "Gives them time to find you," Nathan said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee. "There's a U.S. Marshal out of Helena," he said. "Man named Garrett Hale. I know of him. He's got a reputation for being straight." Clara's breath caught slightly. "You know him personally?" "We've crossed paths. He came through here 2 winters ago looking for a horse thief who'd been working the Gallatin Valley. I put him up for a night." Nathan set down his cup. "He's the kind of man who'll look at what's in that chest and not look away from it. Can you get word to him? I can ride to Bozeman today and send a telegram." Clara looked at him across the table. He was watching her with that direct, steady quality she'd noticed yesterday. Not soft exactly, but not hard either. Something between the two. Something that saw things and didn't flinch from what it saw. "Why are you helping me?" she said. "We talked about this. We talked around it." She set her fork down. "You told me there wasn't a good reason not to. That's not the same as a reason to." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Samuel collected evidence at risk to himself and his family because he thought it was the right thing to do." "Yes." "He didn't finish the job." "He died," Clara said. The words were quiet and flat the way she'd learned to say them. "I know that. I'm not faulting him for it." Nathan looked at her steadily. "I'm saying that someone needs to finish it. And you've been trying to finish it alone for 4 months, and you're about to have a baby, and someone cut the pin out of your axle to try to stop you." He picked up his cup again. "Those are good reasons." Clara stared at him. "You don't know me," she said. "No. You don't know if Samuel's evidence is legitimate. You don't know if Victor Blackwell is who I say he is. You don't know any of it." "No," Nathan said again. "But I know what a frightened woman looks like, and I know what a determined woman looks like, and you don't look frightened. You look like a woman who made a promise she intends to keep." He paused. "I respect that." Clara picked up her fork again. Her hands weren't quite steady, and she hoped he didn't notice, but she thought he probably did, because he seemed to notice most things. "All right," she said. "Then I accept your help. And I want to look at the chest this morning before you ride to Bozeman. I want to show you what Samuel found, so that if something happens to me, there's someone else who knows." Something changed in his face at that, just for a moment, just a flash. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he said. "You can't know that." "No," he said, "but I can make it less likely." They opened the chest together after breakfast on the kitchen table, with the morning light coming through the window and the rain still soft outside. Clara had the key on a cord around her neck. Had worn it there every day since Samuel pressed it into her hand. His grip already weakened by the fever that was going to take him 3 days later. She fitted it to the lock now, and her hands were very steady, steadier than they'd been a few minutes ago. Because this was something she'd been moving toward for 4 months, and the steadiness was the same one she'd used to bury her husband and pack her wagon and drive 19 days across difficult territory alone. When it mattered, she was steady. The lock turned. The chest held more than she'd described the night before, and she watched Nathan's face as he went through it slowly, carefully, with the focused attention of a man reading something that mattered. He didn't rush. He looked at each document the way you looked at evidence when you understood what evidence was and what it meant. The surveying maps first. Samuel had drawn them himself. Precise detailed the lines, fine and deliberate, with notations in his careful handwriting showing where the original boundary markers had been and where they'd been moved to. The discrepancies were not subtle once you knew what you were looking at. Hundreds of acres shifted on paper sold to incoming settlers who had no way of knowing the land they were buying had owners who hadn't agreed to sell it. Then the deed copies. Samuel had made careful copies of both the forged deeds and where he could find them, the originals filed in county records that had been partially altered. He'd noted the alterations in red ink, methodical and clear. The notations of a man who knew his documentation had to be airtight, because the person he was documenting could afford better lawyers than he could. Then the ledger. Nathan went still when he saw it. "What is this?" he said. "Samuel found it in the company office," Clara said. "He wasn't supposed to be in there." He'd gone back to retrieve a set of measuring rods he'd left behind, and the office manager had stepped out, and he saw it on the desk. She paused. He copied out what he could before the manager came back. The ledger pages Samuel had transcribed showed payment records. Not the public accounts of a legitimate land development company, but a second set payments to county recorders, to clerks who'd altered public records to men with last names and no first names, whose specific services weren't described, but whose amounts were significant. One name appeared 6 times. Victor Blackwell, not as a company name, as a person. Receiving payments from his own scheme, funneled back through shell companies and false accounts in amounts that spoke to the kind of wealth that came from doing this not once, but systematically over years in multiple valleys. "He's been running this for a long time," Nathan said quietly. "At least 5 years based on what Samuel found," Clara said. "Possibly longer. The Gallatin Valley land grab was the latest, but there are references to similar operations in 2 other counties." She sat back. "He's not just a businessman who cut corners, Nathan. He's built a system. He has people in the county records office, people in the surveyor's office, probably people in the courts. Anyone who gets close enough to what he's doing disappears or backs off or—" She stopped. Nathan looked up from the ledger. "Or what?" "Samuel's partner," Clara said. "Another surveyor who noticed the same discrepancies. His name was Thomas Reedy. He disappeared 8 months ago. He was going to file a report with the Territorial Land Office, and then he was simply gone." Her voice was level, but something underneath it wasn't. "The official story is that he moved on, found work in Colorado. Nobody looked very hard." The kitchen was very quiet. Nathan closed the ledger carefully. "This is enough," he said. "This is more than enough to bring a federal case." "I know that," Clara said. "Samuel knew that. That's why—" She stopped again and pressed her lips together for a moment, and then continued. "That's why Blackwell needs it gone. The evidence, or the person carrying it, whichever is easier." Nathan was watching her. "You understand what you've been carrying," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. For 4 months. Alone. Pregnant. I was capable of understanding it when I started. Clara. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard from him before. Not softness. He still wasn't a soft man, but something more direct. Something that came from a different place than the practical helpfulness he'd offered since yesterday. You should have gone to the marshal in Billings. The marshal in Billings works for the county sheriff, Clara said. The county sheriff's brother-in-law is on Blackwell's payment ledger. I know that because Samuel wrote it down. A silence. Helena, then, when you first started. I tried. Something crossed her face. I got a letter back saying the territorial marshal's office would review the matter and I should send any relevant documentation through official channels. That was 3 months ago. I haven't heard anything since. She looked at him steadily. Either someone got to that letter before it was answered or the answer was deliberate. Either way, I stopped trusting mail. Nathan sat back in his chair. He looked at the chest, at the documents laid out on the table, at this woman across from him who had spent 4 months trying to do the right thing and had run into the institutional protection of a powerful man at every turn and had kept going anyway. I'll ride to Bozeman, he said. I'll send the telegram to Garrett Hale directly. Not through the territorial office direct personal. Tell him I have something he needs to see and it can't wait. He'll come, Clara said. He'll come, Nathan said. Hale's the kind of man who goes toward things most people walk away from. That's why I remember him. Clara let out a breath. And in the meantime, she said. In the meantime, Nathan said, you stay here. The chest stays here. And nobody but you and me knows any of this. Nathan rode to Bozeman. He was back by mid-afternoon faster than Clara had expected, which told her he'd pushed Gideon harder than he'd normally push him. She was on the porch when he came through the gate, and she read something in the set of his shoulders before he'd even dismounted. Did you send it? She asked. Sent it. He swung down and tied Gideon's reins to the fence rail. Got a reply before I left the office. Clara went still. Hale was already in Bozeman, Nathan said. He came in 2 days ago. Didn't say why. He'll be here by tomorrow morning. Clara stared at him. He was already in Bozeman, she repeated. Yes. That's... She stopped, thought about it. That could be coincidence. Could be. Or Blackwell's not the only one who knows about the chest. Nathan looked at her with that direct, assessing look. Or, he said carefully, Hale's been working this case from a different angle, and he's been looking for the evidence that would let him move. You don't know which? Not yet. She stood on the porch and looked at the mountains beyond the tree line, and thought about what it meant if Marshal Hale was already here. She thought about Samuel's voice the night he'd pressed the key into her hand, his fever-bright eyes, and the terrible clarity he'd had in those last days when the fog lifted and he could see everything sharp and plain. He'd been afraid of the wrong people. He'd been afraid of Blackwell's money and Blackwell's reach and the men Blackwell could pay to make problems go away. He hadn't thought about who else might be watching. We open the chest when Hale gets here, Clara said. Not before. And we do it together. Agreed. And if there's anything in his manner that tells you he's not who you think he is, I'll trust your read as much as mine, Nathan said. You've been navigating this longer than I have. It wasn't what she expected him to say. She looked at him. Thank you, she said. He looked slightly uncomfortable at being thanked the way people looked who weren't used to it, and turned to take Gideon around to the barn. That evening was different from the first one. The rain had stopped entirely by late afternoon, and the air that came in through the kitchen window was clean and cool, the kind of air that came after a storm had cleared something out. Clara had found the stores and done what she could with them, while Nathan was in Bozeman cornbread, from a bag of meal she'd found on the lower shelf, and a pot of vegetable stew from the dried goods lined up in order on the pantry shelves. She'd needed to move slowly and rest twice, and her back had made itself known in emphatic terms, but the cooking had settled something in her the way it always did. The concentration of it. the straightforward transaction of applying skill and getting a result. Nathan came in from the barn and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the table, at the cornbread and the stew and the 2 places set. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I wanted to." She brought the pot to the table. It gave me something to do that wasn't worrying. He sat down without further comment and served himself, and she sat across from him, and they ate in a quiet that was different from the morning quiet. Less careful, more settled. "Tell me about him," Nathan said. Clara looked up. "Samuel, if you want to." He was looking at his bowl. "You don't have to." She thought about it. "He was methodical," she said finally. "About everything. He'd spend an hour figuring out the most efficient way to do a thing before he did it, and then he'd do it exactly right the first time, and it drove me half mad when we were first married because I'm not that kind of person. I do things and adjust as I go." She paused. "But then I realized that he worked that way because he cared. He didn't want to do things wrong. He didn't want to waste time or materials or effort. He was so careful with things, with good things." Her voice softened slightly. "With me." Nathan was listening in the way he did everything with his full attention and without hurry. "He wasn't a big man," Clara continued. "He wasn't the kind of man who looked like a hero. He was thin and he wore spectacles and he spent most of his life looking at maps and measurements. But he saw things other people missed. He paid attention." She was quiet for a moment. "He noticed things were wrong in the Gallatin Valley when 2 surveyors had already been through the same land and hadn't noticed. Because he looked harder. Because he always looked harder." "He sounds like a good man," Nathan said. "He was a great man," Clara said. "And I know people say that about people who've died because it's easier than saying complicated true things, but I mean it plainly. He was a great man. He saw something wrong and he tried to make it right, even when it scared him. Even when he knew what it might cost." She met Nathan's eyes. "He knew. He told me once, 2 weeks before he got sick. He said, 'Clara, I think someone knows I found the ledger.' And I said, 'Samuel, then we stop. We pack up and we go.' And he said," She stopped. Nathan waited. "He said we can't go. There are families on that land right now. Real families, children. They think their homes are theirs. If Blackwell doesn't get stopped, he'll push them off, and there won't be any record that says he's wrong, and they'll have nothing." She pressed her lips together. "He couldn't let that happen. Even when he was scared. Even when I was scared." "And so you promised him," Nathan said. "And so I promised him," Clara said. "And I'm going to keep it." The candle between them burned steadily. Outside, an owl called from somewhere in the pines. "What about you?" Clara said. Before what happened? What kind of man were you?" Nathan was quiet for a moment. "A different kind than I am now," he said. "Were you happy?" "Yes." The word was simple and complete. "I didn't know how happy I was the way you don't usually know. I was just living, working the ranch, riding the fence lines, teaching my boy to fish, coming home to a woman who had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them." Something moved across his face. "I thought I had time to appreciate all of it properly later, when things slowed down, when I wasn't so busy." He looked at his hands on the table. "Later didn't happen." "I know," Clara said softly. "Since then I've just—" He paused, searching for the word. "Maintained. The ranch, the horses. Done what needed doing. Not much else." "You saved me," Clara said. Gideon stopped, Nathan said. "Nathan." He looked at her. "Gideon stopped because he sensed something. You stopped because you chose to." She held his gaze. "That matters." He didn't answer, but something in his face shifted, a slight, almost imperceptible change, the kind that came when something that had been pressed flat for a long time was given a little room to move. The knock came just after dawn. Clara was awake. She'd been awake for an hour, lying in the dark, listening to the way the house breathed in the early morning, feeling the baby shift and turn, going through everything in her head, again and again, the way she couldn't stop herself from doing. The knock was sharp and deliberate. 2 knocks and a pause, and then 2 more, and she heard Nathan's boots on the floorboards moving to the door. She was already dressed. She'd dressed before full light because she'd known Hale might come early, and she'd wanted to be ready. She came out of the back room into the kitchen doorway and stayed there. Nathan opened the door. The man on the porch was around 50, lean and straight-backed, with a face that had been weathered by years outside and a mustache that was going gray at the ends. He wore a federal marshal's badge on his coat, the silver of it catching the early light. He carried his hat in his hands. "Nathan Cole," the man said. "Marshal Hale," Nathan said. Hale's eyes moved past Nathan and found Clara in the kitchen doorway. He held her gaze for a moment, reading her the same way she was reading him, and then he nodded once, a small, precise nod. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I've been looking for you for 6 weeks." The air went out of Clara's lungs. "Looking for me," she said. "Your name came up in a case I've been building for the better part of a year," Hale said. His voice was measured and careful, the voice of a man who chose his words deliberately. "Your husband's name first, and then yours, when it became clear that what Samuel Whitmore had found was no longer in his possession." He paused. "I'd like to come in if that's agreeable." Clara looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at her. "Come in," she said. Hale came in and sat at the kitchen table with his hat on his knee and his hands folded, and Nathan poured coffee without being asked, and Clara sat across from the marshal with her hands flat on the table and her heart beating very fast and very steadily, the same rhythm it had held since the night Samuel pressed a key into her palm and told her to keep it safe. "How long have you been building this case?" she asked. 14 months, Hale said. "I started with a different thread. A complaint from a homesteader family in the Gallatin who couldn't get their deed recognized by the county recorder. It looked like a routine dispute on the surface. But the deeper I looked, the bigger it got," Clara said. "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "The problem was the evidence. What I had from public records showed the discrepancies, but it wasn't enough to move against a man with Blackwell's resources. His lawyers would pick it apart. I needed the internal documentation, the payment records, the original survey evidence showing the markers had been deliberately moved." He paused. "I needed what your husband collected." Clara's fingers pressed flat against the table. "You sent someone to find me," she said. It came out quiet and precise. "I sent a man to Billings to try to find you, yes. 3 months ago. He reported back that you'd left Sold Up and headed northwest. We lost your trail near Livingston." Hale looked at her evenly. "I wasn't the only one looking for you, Mrs. Whitmore. I want you to know that I know that." "The axle pin," Clara said. Hale's expression shifted very slightly. "What happened to your wagon?" "The fastening pin on my left rear axle was removed. Deliberately. The wheel failed on a mountain trail 2 days ago." She kept her voice level. "If Nathan hadn't come along when he did?" "That's Blackwell's people," Hale said. His voice had gone flat and hard. "They've been a step behind you since Billings. I've been trying to get between them and you, but—" He stopped. Something in his face was not comfortable with the admission. "I was too slow." The kitchen was very still. "You were trying to protect me," Clara said slowly. "I was trying to get to you before they did," Hale said. "There's a difference, though, perhaps not a significant one from where you're standing." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about everything Samuel had written down, the meticulous documentation of a careful man, the names and dates and figures that formed an airtight case against a powerful one. She thought about the families on the Gallatin land. She thought about Thomas Reedy, who had gone to Colorado and hadn't. She thought about the key against her chest. She thought about a promise. "The chest is in the back room," she said. "I'll get it." "Clara," Nathan's voice. She looked at him. "You sure?" he said. "Just that. Just checking." She looked at Marshal Hale with his measured voice and his weathered face and the badge that had been following her for 6 weeks and had finally arrived. "Yes," she said. "I'm sure." She went to the back room and came back with the key in her hand, and she opened the chest on the kitchen table for the second time in 2 days, but this time with very different weight in the room. Hale looked at what was inside. He was still for a moment. Then he put his hand in and carefully lifted out the topmost document, one of Samuel's survey maps, and held it to the morning light. He studied it for a long time. Then he set it down and looked at Clara across the table with an expression she hadn't expected. Not the professional satisfaction of a lawman who'd finally found what he needed. Something more complicated. Something that had respect in it. "Your husband was exceptional at his work," Hale said. "I know," Clara said. "This is going to be enough." He was looking at the documents again. "More than enough. With everything here, I can move against Blackwell by the end of the week." Clara's hands were trembling. She looked down at them, surprised. She'd been so steady for so long. She'd been steady through Samuel's illness and his death, and the bank and the long road north, and the broken axle, and the chest and all of it. She'd been steady because she had to be. Nathan's hand came down on the table near hers. Not touching, just nearby. Present. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with that direct, steady look, the one that saw things without flinching. "You did it," he said quietly. She hadn't, not yet. Blackwell was still out there, and his men were somewhere between here and wherever they'd been waiting, and there was still the end of the week to get through before Hale could move. She hadn't done it yet. But the chest was open on Nathan Cole's kitchen table, and a federal marshal who had been building a case for 14 months was looking at the evidence her husband had died for. And somewhere outside, the mountains were gold and clean in the early morning light after the storm. For the first time in 4 months, Clara Whitmore let herself believe it might actually be possible. "Not yet," she said. But she didn't take her hands off the table, and Nathan's hand stayed where it was, and Marshal Hale turned another page, and the morning light moved slowly through the window and across the open chest. And everything that Samuel Whitmore had died trying to protect was exactly where it was supposed to be. Then Hale looked up from the documents, and something in his face had changed. Not the professional focus. That was still there. Something else underneath it. Something that came with the particular quality of someone who was about to say something difficult. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "there's something I need to tell you. About why Blackwell's men have been pushing as hard as they have to find you." He paused. "It's not just about the evidence." Clara looked at him. "Samuel's survey partner," Hale said. "Thomas Reedy, the man who disappeared 8 months ago. What about him?" "He didn't go to Colorado," Hale said. "He's alive. He's been in protective custody in Helena for the past 2 months. He came to me when he heard I was building the case." Hale's voice was careful and steady. "He's been waiting to testify. But there was a problem." Clara waited. "Reedy's account of what he found is credible but incomplete," Hale said. "He didn't have the documentation to back it up. He could describe what he saw in the records office, what he found in the field, but Blackwell's lawyers would tear apart an uncorroborated eyewitness account from a man who'd gone into hiding." He looked at Clara with absolute directness. "What he needed, what I needed, was exactly what's in this chest." Clara stared at him. "Reedy is alive," she said. "Yes, and Blackwell's men knew Reedy was in custody. They knew you had a partial case. And they knew that if Samuel's evidence was brought forward combined with Reedy's testimony, it would be airtight," Hale said. "There would be no defense, no legal maneuvering, no escape." "So it wasn't just about silencing me," Clara said slowly. "It was about making sure the two pieces never came together." "Yes." She sat with that for a moment. Then she looked at the chest, at the documents that Samuel had spent the last weeks of his life collecting and protecting, at the careful handwriting of a methodical man who looked harder than everyone else, and wrote down what he found, who had been afraid and done it anyway. "He knew," Clara said quietly. "He knew what this was worth. He knew that if this evidence could be connected to a credible witness, he would have known it was a federal case," Hale said. "Yes. Your husband understood exactly what he had." "He died for it," Clara said. The words were simple and flat and true. "I know," Hale said, "and I'm sorry for it. Genuinely. I'm going to make sure that what he did mattered." The kitchen held that statement for a moment. Then Clara straightened her back, both hands flat on the table, and looked at the federal marshal with an expression that was not grief, and was not relief, and was not triumph, but was something older and harder and more real than any of those things. "Then let's finish it," she said. Nathan, from where he stood at the edge of the kitchen, made a sound that was not quite a word. But when Clara glanced at him, he was already moving toward the table, pulling out a chair, sitting down, and there was something in his face that she hadn't seen there yet. Not hope, not quite. Something that was considering hope. Something that was looking at it from across a careful distance and taking it seriously for the first time in a long while. The morning light came through the window. The chest sat open on the table, and 3 people in a quiet ranch kitchen in the Montana Territory began to plan the end of Victor Blackwell. Hale spent 2 hours at that kitchen table. He went through every document in the chest, the way a man goes through something he's been searching for long enough that finding it doesn't feel real, yet slowly, carefully, like he was afraid it might change if he moved too fast. He read Samuel's survey maps twice. He held the copied ledger pages up to the light. He cross-referenced dates against a small notebook he pulled from his coat pocket, checking Samuel's findings against whatever he'd already assembled from 14 months of building his case from the outside in. Nathan made more coffee and didn't say much. Clara sat across from Hale and answered his questions as they came. When did Samuel first notice the discrepancies which county recorder's office had the altered files? How had Samuel gotten access to the company ledger? And she answered each one directly and completely, the way she'd been rehearsing in her head for 4 months, because she had always known this conversation was coming, and she had not let herself think about what it would feel like when it finally arrived. It felt like putting down something very heavy. Not all the way down, not yet, but enough to feel the difference in her arms. When Hale finally sat back and looked at her, his expression had settled into something that was almost not quite relief. "This is everything," he said. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to understand what I'm telling you. This is every piece I was missing. The payment records, the survey evidence, the forged deed documentation combined with Reedy's testimony. There is not a judge in the Montana Territory who looks at this and doesn't move forward." He closed the chest with a careful, deliberate hand. "Victor Blackwell is done." Clara held those words in her chest for a moment. "When?" she said. "I need to get back to Helena with this tonight," Hale said. "I'll have warrants drawn by morning. I can have men in the Gallatin Valley by the end of the week." He paused. "But I need you to stay here until I send word that the arrest has been made. Blackwell can't know the chest reached me before I have him in custody. If he knows, if his people report back that they lost you and a federal marshal showed up at a ranch near Bozeman the same morning, he'll run. He has the money and the connections to disappear, and then this all comes to nothing. You need me to stay hidden," Clara said. "For 3 days, maybe 4. She looked at Nathan. He was leaning against the kitchen wall with his arms crossed, watching the marshal with the careful, measuring look she'd come to recognize as his thinking face. "Is there a risk to her here?" Nathan asked. "There's a risk wherever she is, until Blackwell is in custody," Hale said honestly. "But his men don't know where she landed when the wagon broke. They know she was on the mountain trail north of the Gallatin. They don't know about your ranch. If you don't draw attention—" He looked at Nathan directly. "Keep her off the road, and don't send any more telegrams until you hear from me." "Understood," Nathan said. Hale stood, settled his hat on his head, and looked at Clara one more time. Something in his expression had the texture of something that had been weighing on him. "Your husband," he said. "What he did took more courage than most men have. I want you to know that I know that." Clara stood too. She was a tall woman, and she met Hale's eyes without tilting her head much. "He knew it was dangerous, and he did it anyway," she said. "He always said the danger didn't change whether a thing was right." Hale nodded once, the small, precise nod. "I'll send word from Helena the moment the warrants are signed," he said. "Don't open the door for anyone you don't know." He walked out. Nathan followed him to the porch, and Clara heard them exchange a few words she couldn't make out, low and serious, and then hoofbeats moving away down the road. Nathan came back inside. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, and Clara realized her hands were pressed flat to the top of the closed chest, both palms down, like she was holding it in place. She looked at her own hands and made herself move them. 3 days, she said. Maybe 4, Nathan said. I can do 3 days. I know you can. He came into the kitchen and picked up the coffee cups from the table. You've been doing impossible things for 4 months. 3 days ought to be easy. It was the most she'd heard him say that wasn't strictly functional, and it came out slightly wry, and she almost laughed. The almost was enough. I'll put the chest back in the room, she said. I'll carry it. I can. Clara. He looked at her. Let me carry the chest. She stepped back and let him carry it. The first day passed quietly. Nathan worked the ranch as he always did, and Clara moved through the house with the slow, deliberate rhythm her body required, resting when she had to, and refusing to rest longer than she absolutely needed to. She found his bookshelf 3 shelves against the back wall of the main room. Books stacked 2 deep, more than she'd expected from a man who described his life in terms of fence lines and weather patterns. She pulled out a collection of territorial maps and spread them on the table, and spent 2 hours tracing the route from Bozeman to Helena, calculating how long it would take Hale to arrive, how long to draw the warrants, how long for men to ride south to the Gallatin Valley. Nathan came in from the barn at midday and found her with the maps. Figuring something out, he said. Trying to calculate the timing, she said. If Hale left this morning and made good time, he gets to Helena tonight. Warrants tomorrow morning at the earliest, assuming a judge is available. Riders south. You can't control the timeline, Nathan said. He sat down across from her. Hale knows his business. I know he does. She looked up. That doesn't stop me from calculating. No, he said. I reckon it doesn't. He looked at the maps. You're like Samuel. She blinked. You said he worked a thing over and over before he did it, Nathan said. You're doing the same thing. Different method, same instinct. He paused, wanting to understand what's coming. Clara looked at the maps for a moment. I used to tell him it was excessive, she said. All that preparation before acting. I used to say, Samuel, sometimes you just have to move and adjust as you go. She folded the corner of the nearest map carefully. I understand it better now. What changed? Having something to lose, she said simply. When you don't have much to lose, the cost of getting it wrong is survivable. When you do... She stopped, pressed her hand to her belly for a moment, a gesture that had become automatic. You calculate more. Nathan looked at her hand on her belly. Then he looked at the table. Are you frightened? He asked. About the birth. You don't have to answer. Yes, she said without hesitation. I'm frightened every day. I was frightened with my daughter, and that fear turned out to be... She stopped. Warranted. So yes, I'm frightened. What can I do? The question came out simple and direct, the way he did most things, and Clara looked at him, and something shifted in her chest that she wasn't quite prepared for. You're already doing it, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, and stood and went back out to the barn, and Clara looked at the maps for another hour, but didn't absorb much of them. The second night was when things changed. Nathan was at the fence on the north boundary fixing a post that had worked loose in the storm when he heard Gideon. Not a nick or something sharper. The quick high sound of a horse that has registered a threat. Nathan straightened and looked toward the tree line. 2 riders. Sitting still at the edge of the pines about 200 yards out. Not moving, just watching the ranch. He kept his hands on the fence post. Didn't reach for his rifle. Didn't change his posture. He kept working slowly while he measured what he was looking at. They weren't Hale's men. Hale's men would have come down the road. These 2 were in the trees, which meant they'd come up the back side of the ridge, which meant they knew enough about this property to avoid the road, which meant someone had given them specific information about where to look. He finished with the fence post. He picked up his tools with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had nothing on his mind. He walked back toward the barn, and the moment the barn wall came between him and the tree line, he moved. He was through the barn and across the yard and into the back door of the house in under a minute. Clara was at the kitchen table with one of the books from his shelf open in front of her, and she looked up at his face and was on her feet before he'd said a word. "What?" she said. "Two riders in the tree line to the north. They've been watching the property." He was already at the front window, standing to the side of it, not in front of it. "They came up the ridge, off the road." Clara's face went very still. "How long?" she said. "Don't know. Gideon caught them. Could be travelers. Travelers don't sit in tree lines for 10 minutes without moving." She pressed her lips together. He could see her working through it, the same calculation she'd done with the maps, same instinct to understand before acting, but faster now, with the particular sharpness of someone who'd been calculating danger for 4 months. "They don't know what's in the house," she said. "They know I was on the trail north of the Gallatin. They've been tracking north. They found your property or someone told them about it." She stopped. "The telegram." Nathan looked at her. "You sent the telegram to Hale and Bozeman," she said. "If Blackwell has someone in the telegraph office—" "The message was addressed to Hale personally," Nathan said. "My name on it, my ranch location." "And Blackwell's people know Hale is building a case," Clara said. "If a telegram from a private citizen goes to a federal marshal in Bozeman, a man Blackwell would know is dangerous to him." She looked at Nathan. They would have read it. The air in the kitchen went tight. "They know Hale was here," Nathan said. "They know the evidence reached him, or they suspect it." Clara was very steady. Her voice hadn't changed. "Which means they have nothing left to lose by coming here. The chest is in the back room." "The chest doesn't matter anymore," Clara said. "Hale has what he needs. The chest is just wood and iron now." She looked toward the front window. What they want now is to make sure there's no one left to testify. The word testify landed between them with its full weight. Nathan moved to the gun cabinet. He didn't take long about it, a rifle checked and loaded, and his sidearm already on his hip. "Is there anyone you trust in Bozeman?" Clara said. "Anyone who could get word to Hale?" "My neighbor Bill Carey is 7 miles south," Nathan said. "His boy rides fast. But I'd need to get a message to Bill first, and I can't leave you here." "You're not leaving me anywhere," Clara said with a precision that brooked no argument. "What else?" He thought fast. "If they're watching the north side," he said, "the south road is still open. Bill's boy could be in Bozeman in 2 hours if he pushed. Then we need to get a message to Bill Carey." "I can ride south without going past the north tree line," Nathan said. 15 minutes to Bill's place message delivered back in 30. If those riders stay put, and if they don't stay put. He looked at her. "I won't leave unless you're secure," he said. "There's a room off the root cellar. Solid door, single entrance. Take the chest and the rifle from the back room and go in, and don't open it for anyone but me." "How will I know it's you?" 3 knocks, and then 2. He held her gaze. "Don't open it for anything else." Clara looked at him for a moment, with the particular focus of someone who was making a decision about trust, which was the most serious decision a person could make, and he held still while she made it. "All right," she said. She was faster than he expected getting the chest into the root cellar room. He didn't offer to help because she didn't ask for it, and he was beginning to understand that not asking for help wasn't stubbornness, but dignity, and there was a difference. She went through the root cellar with the rifle from the back room tucked under her arm and the chest's handle in her other hand, and she moved with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided something and was doing it. He settled her in the room lamp water, the rifle propped against the wall where she could reach it, and looked at her one last time. 3 and then 2, she said. 3 and then 2, he confirmed. She reached out and grabbed his wrist. It was sudden enough that he went still. "Come back," she said. Just those two words. Direct and plain the way she said everything. Something moved in his chest. "I will," he said. He rode south low and fast, keeping the barn between himself and the north tree line for as long as the terrain allowed. His heart was working harder than the ride required, and he was honest enough with himself to know why. He'd told someone he'd come back. He'd made that a promise with the particular weight of a promise made by a man who knew exactly what it cost when promises got broken. And for the first time in 3 years, the feeling of having someone waiting for him didn't feel like a chain. It felt like a direction. Bill Carey was splitting wood when Nathan rode up, and Nathan was off Gideon before the horse had properly stopped, and talking before Bill had set down his axe. "Two riders watching my north line. I need your boy to ride to Bozeman, telegraph Marshal Hale and Helena. The message is that the package is secure, but the wolves have found the den. Hale will understand." Bill Carey was 60 years old and had been ranching the Gallatin for 30 of them, and he looked at Nathan for exactly 2 seconds before he turned toward the house and bellowed for his son. The boy, 16, lean with his father's steady eyes, was saddled and on the road to Bozeman in 4 minutes. Nathan was already riding back. The two riders came off the ridge at dusk. Nathan was on the porch when they came through the gate, and he stood with his rifle across his forearm, not raised, not aimed, but present and unambiguous. He recognized the posture of hired men, the particular combination of confidence and wariness that came from being paid to do things other people didn't want to do themselves. The one in front was big, weathered with a coat that was too heavy for the summer heat, and the specific kind of stillness that meant he was comfortable around violence. "Evening," he said. "Reckon it is," Nathan said. "We're looking for a woman. Came through this part of the territory a few days back. Pregnant widow traveling with a wagon." "Lot of people travel this road," Nathan said. "This one you'd remember," the man said. His eyes were moving over the house, the barn, the yard, cataloging. "Brown hair, heavy set, broken down wagon." Nathan looked at him steadily. "Haven't seen any broken down wagons," he said. The man's eyes came back to Nathan's face. He spent a moment reading it. "Mind if we look around?" he said. "I mind considerably," Nathan said. "This is private property." A silence. The second rider had moved slightly to the left, the casual repositioning of someone creating an angle. Nathan didn't look at him directly, but he tracked the movement in his peripheral. "We're not looking to cause trouble," the big man said. "That's good to hear," Nathan said. "Because trouble on this property has a way of not going the direction people expect." Another silence, longer this time. The big man was calculating. Nathan could see him doing it, running the numbers, assessing the rifle, reading the particular stillness of a man who'd handled dangerous situations before and hadn't blinked once since they rode in. "If you see a woman matching that description," the big man said, "Victor Blackwell would be grateful to know her whereabouts. Generous-like, grateful." Nathan looked at him. "Tell Mr. Blackwell," Nathan said carefully, "that I don't know the name, and I don't know the woman, and I'd be obliged if his people stayed off my fence lines." The big man stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back through the gate, the second rider following. Nathan watched them go, until the road bent and the trees took them, and then he stood on the porch for a full 5 minutes more, listening before he went inside. He went straight to the root cellar. 3 knocks. Pause. 2. The bolt slid back. Clara was on her feet with the rifle in her hands when he opened the door, and she lowered it the moment she saw him. And the expression on her face moved through 3 things. Very fast. Relief, and then something more complicated. And then the deliberate composure she put on top of things when she didn't want them to show. "They came to the house," she said. 2 of them. I sent them off." He looked at her. "You all right?" "I've been better." She set the rifle against the wall. What did they want? What they always want. Information. He paused. "They know your description. They used Blackwell's name." Clara closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "They're not done," she said. "No, Nathan said. They went down the road, but they didn't go far. I'd bet my ranch on it. He looked at her steadily. We need to move you. Move me where? Bill Carey's place. His wife is there. It's further south, and it's off the road they're watching. He paused. It's also 7 miles further from those two men. Clara looked at him, then at the chest, then back at him. The chest stays here, he said. Hale has everything he needs. The chest is just the original. We keep it safe, but it doesn't need to go with you. She thought about this. They'll search the house, she said. Let them. Nathan. Clara. He held her gaze. Hale is moving. Your boy got to Bozeman an hour ago, give or take. By morning, Hale has men in the Gallatin. Blackwell is running out of time, and his people know it, and men who are running out of time make mistakes. He paused. I need you somewhere. I know you're safe while that plays out. She looked at him for a long moment with that reading behind the eyes look. Your neighbor's wife, she said. What's she like? Name's Ruth Carey. She's delivered half the babies in this part of the territory. He watched something shift in Clara's face. She's good, and she'll keep quiet. Clara put both hands on her belly for a moment. Not distress, just the habitual check, the constant communication with the person inside her. All right, she said. They went out the back through the kitchen garden wide around the south side of the barn. Nathan had Gideon saddled in 6 minutes. Getting Clara up was a more careful business. This time, her back had been troubling her all day, more than she'd said he could tell from the way she'd been moving, and he steadied her from the side without comment, and she got herself up and settled, and they moved out at a walk, keeping the barn between them and the road north for as long as the terrain allowed. She didn't speak until they were well down the south trail, the ranch behind them, the night coming in cool and clear after the storm. Do you believe in things working out? She said. Nathan thought about the question seriously. I used to, he said. And now? He was quiet for a moment. The horse moved steadily beneath them, Gideon's footfalls soft on the dry trail. I believe in people doing what they decide to do, he said finally. I don't know if things work out, but I think the deciding matters. Clara was quiet for a moment. Samuel believed that, she said. He said outcomes weren't the point. He said the point was whether you looked at the right thing and did it anyway. Smart man, Nathan said, same as he'd said the night before. You keep saying that. Keep meaning it. She made a sound that was closer to a laugh than she'd gotten before. He brought her to the Carey place, and Ruth Carey opened the door before they'd knocked. The boy had told her something was coming, apparently because she had a lamp in one hand and the look of a woman who had already decided to be ready. Ruth was in her 50s, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped silver hair and the particular calm of someone who had seen a great deal of difficult things and had not been broken by any of them. She took one look at Clara and another look at Nathan, and she said, "Bring her inside," in a tone that was completely in charge of the situation. She settled Clara in a back bedroom, while Nathan spoke quietly with Bill Carey in the front room. He told Bill everything: the chest, Blackwell the marshal, the riders on the north line. Bill listened without interrupting. You think they'll come back to your place tonight? Bill said. I think they already are, Nathan said. And you're going back. I'm going back. Bill looked at him for a moment, with the particular look of a man who'd known Nathan Cole for 6 years, and had watched him spend 3 of those years closing every door he had. You found something worth going back for, Bill said. It wasn't quite a question. Nathan put his hat on. I'll send word when Hale's men arrive, he said. He rode back north. The ranch was dark when he came through the gate, which was what he'd expected. But the barn door was hanging open at a wrong angle, which he hadn't left it, and he pulled Gideon up short and sat still and listened. Nothing moved. He dismounted quietly and circled the barn from the outside. The door had been forced, the latch splintered from the frame. Inside, 3 of his horses were restless in their stalls. His organized tack room had been pulled apart, everything down from the hooks and off the shelves, searched fast and without care. He went to the house. Same story, every drawer open, every cabinet pulled wide. Everything that could hold something the size of a document had been checked. They'd been looking for the chest, or for copies, or for anything that could be used as evidence. He found the chest where he'd left it in the root cellar and let himself breathe out. They'd looked everywhere except down. He sat in the kitchen with his rifle and waited. At 2 a.m, he heard a horse. One horse this time coming in from the north road slower and more carefully than the 2 riders from the evening. He was at the front window before the rider reached the gate. The rider stopped outside the fence. "Cole!" a voice called out. Not loud. Measured. The voice of a man who was certain he didn't need to shout to be heard. Nathan opened the door and stood in it. The man outside the fence was dressed too well for a night ride, which meant he'd come from somewhere with a roof and a mirror. He was around 50 silver at the temples, with the smooth-faced confidence of a man who had not heard no from anyone in a long time. Nathan had never seen Victor Blackwell in person. He didn't need to be introduced. "Mr. Cole," Blackwell said. He had his hands visible, which was deliberate. A man demonstrating he wasn't reaching for anything. The gesture of someone who had learned that looking reasonable was its own kind of weapon. "I apologize for the hour." "I don't recall inviting you," Nathan said. "No, you didn't." Blackwell smiled. It was the kind of smile that had gotten him a long way in rooms full of people who mistook pleasantness for goodness. "I think there's been some misunderstanding. About Mrs. Whitmore. About what she's carrying." "Don't know the name," Nathan said. "Mr. Cole!" Blackwell's voice was patient with the particular patience of a man who knew he had leverage and was in no hurry to deploy it. "You sent a telegraph to a federal marshal this morning from Bozeman. The telegraph operator is a conscientious man." He paused. "I know she was here. I know she gave Hale whatever her husband collected, and I know that you understand what that means for both of you going forward." Nathan said nothing. "I'm a practical man," Blackwell said. "I'm not looking for trouble with you specifically. You didn't know what you were getting into when you picked her up on that trail. I understand that." He tilted his head slightly. "But there are ways this can go that are better for everyone, including you. Including her. Including—" His eyes dropped briefly pointedly to Nathan's midsection, a reference to Clara's pregnancy, oblique and cold. "Everyone." Nathan felt something shift in him, not fear. He recognized what fear felt like, and this wasn't it. It was the specific, cold clarity that came when something complicated became very simple. "You came here yourself," Nathan said. "I wanted to resolve this personally. A man who sends other men to pull axle pins out of a pregnant woman's wagon," Nathan said, "doesn't usually come personally." Something moved behind Blackwell's eyes. A small recalculation. "I don't know what you're referring to. You're here because Hale's already moving and you know it," Nathan said. "You're here because your men couldn't find what they were looking for and you're running out of time, and you thought maybe you could say something to me directly that would make me hesitate." He looked at Blackwell steadily across the dark yard. "You made one mistake." "And what was that?" Blackwell said. The pleasantness had thinned slightly. "You thought this was about what I'd lose," Nathan said. "You thought you could talk to me about practical considerations and going forward and what's better for everyone." He paused. "You don't know me very well, Mr. Blackwell." A silence. The night was absolutely still. "There are families on that land in the Gallatin," Nathan said. "Real families. Children. That's what Samuel Whitmore wrote down in his careful handwriting, and that's what his wife carried 4 months alone across hard territory to make sure someone heard. That's what Thomas Reedy saw and ran to a federal marshal to report." He looked at Blackwell's smooth, well-dressed face in the darkness. "I've been alone on this ranch for 3 years because I decided it was safer not to care about things. I reckon I was wrong about that. And I reckon you showing up here tonight is the clearest proof of it." Blackwell stared at him. The pleasantness was entirely gone now. "You don't understand what I can bring down on—" "Garrett Hale is drawing warrants in Helena tonight," Nathan said. "By the time you ride back to wherever you've been sleeping, he'll have men heading for the Gallatin Valley. and you'll want to be somewhere a federal marshal can find you when he comes looking, because a man who runs is a man who's admitting he knows exactly what he did." Blackwell said nothing. For the first time since he'd ridden up to the fence, the confidence in his posture had shifted into something that looked around the edges like fear. "Get off my property," Nathan said. For a long moment, Blackwell didn't move. Then he turned his horse, and Nathan Cole stood in his doorway and watched Victor Blackwell ride back into the dark and felt the cold clarity in his chest settle into something slower and heavier. Not victory, it was too early for that, and too much could still go wrong, and he knew it. But something. The sure knowledge that he'd put himself between something wrong and the people it was aimed at. That he'd stood when it would have been simpler to step aside. He went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and waited for morning. 3 miles south at the Carey place, Clara Whitmore lay awake in a clean bed and listened to Ruth Carey moving quietly in the next room, and thought about Nathan Cole standing on his porch with a rifle across his arm, and thought about promises, and thought about what it meant when a person who had stopped believing in things started again. She pressed her hand to her belly. Almost, she told her baby. Almost done. Outside, the Montana night was deep and still, and somewhere to the south a rider was on the road to Helena with the weight of 14 months of careful work riding with him. And the morning was coming as it always did, indifferent to what men wanted, and faithful only to the turning of the world. And in the turning, something was about to break open. The telegram from Hale arrived at the Carey place the following afternoon. Bill Carey's boy brought it from Bozeman at a full gallop, the horse lathered, and the boy's face flushed with the particular excitement of a 16-year-old who understood he was carrying something that mattered. Ruth took the envelope from him at the door and brought it straight to Clara without opening it, which was a kind of respect that Clara noticed and appreciated. Clara opened it at the kitchen table with Ruth standing nearby, and Nathan, who had ridden down from the ranch an hour earlier, sitting across from her. She read it once, then she read it again. Then she set it down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the wood and breathed. "What does it say?" Nathan asked. "Warrant signed this morning," Clara said. "Hale has 8 deputies riding for the Gallatin Valley. Blackwell's main office in Helena was served at dawn." She stopped, looked up. "They found him." Nathan was very still. "Found him where?" "He tried to leave," Clara said. "Last night after." She looked at Nathan. "After he left your ranch, he went back to wherever he'd been staying, and he packed up, and he tried to ride north. Hale had a man watching the road out of Bozeman." She looked back at the telegram. "Victor Blackwell is in federal custody as of 6 o'clock this morning." Ruth Carey let out a breath behind her that was almost a laugh. Nathan said nothing. Clara looked at the telegram one more time. Then she folded it carefully and held it against her chest for a moment, and her eyes closed, and she sat very still. When she opened them, Nathan was watching her. "It's over," he said, quietly, not a question. "It's over," she said, and then without deciding to, she put her face in her hands and wept. Not the controlled 3-minute grief she permitted herself on the trail, but something larger and older than that. Something that had been waiting behind 4 months of steady forward motion. And it came out of her now, in the warm kitchen of a neighbor's house she'd never been inside before yesterday, with Ruth Carey's hand on her shoulder, and Nathan Cole sitting across the table, not saying anything, not moving away, just being exactly where he was. She cried for Samuel. She cried for the promise she'd made and the road it had cost her. She cried for the daughter she'd buried 2 years ago, and the child she was carrying now, who didn't know yet what kind of world she was coming into. She cried until there was nothing left to cry, which took longer than 3 minutes, and neither Ruth nor Nathan tried to stop her or speed her along or fill the space with reassurances she didn't need. When she was done, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked up. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't," Ruth said firmly from behind her. "Don't you dare apologize for that." Nathan had both hands on the table, the way he sometimes sat when he was thinking. He looked at her the way he looked at most things, directly and without pretense. "You kept your promise," he said. Samuel kept his, Clara said. I just carried it. That's not a small thing, carrying something that far. She looked at him. Something in his voice was different, and she noticed it, and she thought she understood it, but wasn't ready to say so. No, she agreed. It isn't. She went into labor that night. It started the way the book Ruth kept on the bedroom shelf said it would, low and slow. The kind of ache that could be mistaken for the back pain she'd been managing for weeks, except that this had a rhythm to it, a tide-like quality that pulled and receded and pulled again with increasing intention. Clara recognized it at 11 o'clock and lay still for 20 minutes timing it before she called out. Ruth was in the room before the echo of her voice had settled. How far apart? Ruth said, already moving, already doing the things that needed doing. The lamp turned up the water put on her hands washing. 8 minutes, Clara said. Maybe 7. Your first was... Ruth stopped herself. Stillborn, Clara said. The word was flat and honest. 20 months ago. There was never a cry. Ruth looked at her directly. Not with pity, with something more useful. This is a different baby, she said. Different night. You hear me? I hear you, Clara said. I know that. She breathed through the next contraction, which arrived on schedule and was more serious than the last one. That doesn't mean I'm not frightened. Good, Ruth said, which was not what Clara expected. Frightened means you're paying attention. Frightened is fine. You just keep breathing, and you do what your body tells you to do, and I'll be right here. Clara gripped the bedpost. Nathan, she said. Ruth glanced toward the door. He's in the house, she said. He came back inside when he heard you call. Tell him? She stopped as the contraction built, breathed, released. Tell him to stay. I don't need him in here, but I need to know he's there. Ruth went to the door and said something low that Clara couldn't hear from the bed, and then came back, and Clara heard Nathan's boots on the floorboards outside in the hall, not pacing, just present. Settled in one place, staying. It steadied her more than she could account for. It was a long labor, 4 hours and then 5, and the contractions came harder and closer, and Clara worked through each one with the focused physical discipline of a woman who had decided this child was coming into the world alive and healthy, and that was the end of the conversation. Ruth coached her through the worst of it with calm, precise instructions and no false comfort, which was exactly what Clara needed, not reassurance, but accurate information, not sweetness, but competence. At 3 in the morning, Clara heard Nathan's voice in the hall. Ruth! Low and controlled, but she could hear the tight edge underneath it. How is she? She's working, Ruth said. Is something wrong? Nothing's wrong. Birth is hard. Go sit down. A pause. I'm not going to sit down, Nathan said. Then stand, but stay out of my way. Clara would have laughed if she'd had the spare capacity for it. She filed it away to tell him later. Another hour, the longest one. Clara stopped thinking about Samuel and stopped thinking about the telegram and stopped thinking about anything except the immediate physical reality of what her body was doing, which required everything she had. Ruth's voice steady and quiet. The lamp, the sound of the wind outside. Nathan's boots on the other side of the door not going anywhere. At 4:17 in the morning, her daughter was born. The cry came immediately, sharp and loud and indignant. The cry of someone who had arrived in the world and had opinions about it, and Clara heard it and felt something leave her body that was not the child. Something that had been locked there for 20 months. Some held thing that finally let go, and she was crying before she knew she was crying. And she couldn't tell if the sound she was making was grief, or relief, or joy, or all of them at once, because there was no way to separate them. They were all the same river. She's here, Ruth said, and her voice for the first time all night had something warm in it. She's here, and she's loud, and she's perfect. Let me... Clara could barely speak. Let me... Ruth placed the baby in her arms. She was red and furious, and had her eyes screwed shut against the indignity of cold air, and she weighed almost nothing, and she weighed everything, and Clara held her and said nothing for a long moment, because there was nothing that language could do with what she was feeling. Then she said very quietly, "Hello." The baby's cry shifted slightly, the way newborns' cries sometimes did when they heard the voice they'd been hearing from inside. "Hello?" Clara said again. "I'm your mother. I've been looking forward to meeting you for a very long time." Ruth opened the bedroom door 20 minutes later. Nathan was in the hall. He hadn't sat down. He was standing with his back against the wall and his arms crossed and his hat in his hands. And when the door opened, he looked at Ruth with an expression that he didn't bother to control. And Ruth, who had seen a great many things in her life, thought later that she hadn't seen a man's face look quite like that in a while. Like someone who had been holding his breath for 4 months and was only now remembering that he was allowed to stop. "She's fine," Ruth said. "Both of them are fine. The baby's healthy. Good strong cry." Nathan put one hand against the wall. "Can I—" He stopped. "Give them a few minutes," Ruth said, not unkindly. "Then you can go in." He nodded. He stood in the hall and said nothing, and Ruth went back into the room, and he stood there and looked at the ceiling, and did whatever men did when they were feeling something they hadn't felt in long enough that they'd forgotten what to do with it. When Ruth came to this door again and nodded, he went in. Clara was sitting up against the pillows with the baby in the crook of her arm. She looked not fine, that was too small a word. She looked like someone who had done something enormous and come through the other side of it, the way people looked after something that had cost everything and delivered everything in return. Exhausted in a way that went past the body, and at the same time, incandescent. She looked up when he came in. "Come see her," she said. He crossed the room and stood beside the bed and looked at the baby. She was asleep now, her face settled into the particular absolute peace of a newborn who had decided, having made her feelings known upon arrival, that the world was acceptable. She had a surprising amount of dark hair, and her small fists were curled against her chest. Nathan looked at her for a long time without speaking. Clara watched him do it. She saw what moved across his face, and she didn't try to name it for him. She understood that some things needed room to exist before they could be talked about. "She's all right," he said finally. His voice was not quite even. "She's perfect," Clara said. "Ruth says she's healthy. Good weight, good lungs, she demonstrated that thoroughly." "I heard," Nathan said. Something in the two words that wasn't quite a smile, but was related to one. "Do you want to hold her?" Clara said. He looked at the baby, then at Clara. "I haven't—" He stopped. "I know," Clara said. "I know you haven't. Do you want to—" A long pause. "Yes," he said. "He's." She showed him how to take her, and he took her with the careful, slightly rigid-armed deliberateness of a man who was afraid of doing it wrong. And Clara adjusted his arm angle once, and then let go, and he stood beside the bed, holding a 4-hour-old baby. And something happened in his face that undid something in Clara's chest, some last locked thing, something she hadn't known was still locked. He looked at the baby the way he'd looked at his own son, she thought. Not the same. Nothing could be the same. But from the same part of him that had existed before the winter night that took everything. The part that had learned to close and had spent 3 years closed and was opening now with the particular painful slowness of something that had been shut for a long time. "She needs a name," Clara said softly. Nathan looked up. "That's your business," he said. "Not mine." "I know." She paused. "I was thinking about Grace." He was quiet. "My daughter," Clara said. "The one I lost. Her name was Lily." She looked at the baby in his arms. "This one, I keep thinking about what she represents. What it cost to get her here. What it means that she arrived alive and loud and angry at the world." She paused. "Grace feels right." "Grace," Nathan said, testing it. "Or something else. I'm still thinking." "No," he said. "Grace." He looked at the baby. It fits. Clara let herself lean back against the pillows fully for the first time all night and felt the exhaustion settle into her properly. "Nathan," she said. He looked at her over the baby's head. "Thank you," she said. "I know I've said it before, but I need to say it again so it's on record properly. You stopped on that trail, and you didn't have to, and everything that has happened since Hale, the warrants, Blackwell in custody, none of that happens if you keep riding." She held his gaze. "Samuel's promise gets kept because you stopped." Nathan looked at her steadily. "You'd have found another way," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but I didn't have to because you stopped." She paused. "Why, really? Not the absence of a good reason not to. The real answer." He was quiet for a long moment, the baby asleep in his arms. "Because I saw you on your knees in the gravel with your hands in fists," he said finally. "And you weren't giving up, and I recognized that." He looked at Grace. "And I hadn't recognized anything in a long time." The room was very quiet. "When did you stop recognizing things?" Clara asked. "When I decided it was safer not to," he said. "And now," he looked at her, "I think I was wrong about safer." The morning brought Bill Carey with fresh news from Bozeman. Hale's deputies had served warrants on 3 county officials in the Gallatin Valley: the county recorder, whose office had held the altered documents, a surveying office clerk who'd been on Blackwell's payment ledger, and a deputy sheriff whose last name Clara recognized from Samuel's notes. All 3 were in custody by morning. The Land Development Company's offices in 2 counties had been sealed, pending the federal investigation. The families on the disputed land, the homesteaders who'd been told their claims weren't valid, who'd been receiving letters from Blackwell's lawyers threatening eviction, had been formally notified that the proceedings against them were halted. Bill read all of this from the second telegram of the day and looked at Clara over the edge of the paper. "That's your husband's work," he said. "All of that right there. That's what he collected." Clara was sitting in the kitchen with Grace asleep in her arms. She had slept 3 hours and felt paradoxically more awake than she had in months. "That's Samuel," she agreed. Nathan was at the table across from her. He'd been up all night, she knew, because she'd heard him in the hall until dawn, and when Ruth had finally made him go sleep in the front room, he'd gone, but she didn't think he'd actually slept. He looked tired in the way of someone who was too relieved to sleep. "There'll be a hearing," Bill said. "Federal court. They'll want testimony from you, Mrs. Whitmore, and from Reedy." "I know," Clara said. "I'll be there." "You just had a baby this morning," Ruth said from the stove in a tone that was not asking for a debate. "I know that too," Clara said. "I didn't say today." She looked at Bill. "When?" "Month or 2, most likely. Hale'll send word." "A month or 2. Clara looked down at Grace, who had the serene indifference of a person who was not yet aware that federal court hearings were a concern. "A month," Clara said. "I can do a month." She could feel Nathan looking at her from across the table. She didn't look up immediately. She was aware of something that had been shifting in the room between them since last night, since before last night if she was honest, something that neither of them had said directly, because there had always been something more immediate in the way, and now the immediate things were resolving one by one, and the thing that had been shifting was becoming harder to not notice. She looked up. He was watching her with that direct, steady look. She held it. "You'll need time to recover," he said, "before you travel anywhere." "Yes." "The Carey place is—" "Ruth would probably—" "Nathan," Clara said. He stopped. She looked at him very directly, the way she did when she wanted there to be no ambiguity. "Are you trying to figure out where I'm going to go?" she said. "Or are you trying to figure out how to ask me not to go?" A silence. Bill Carey suddenly became very interested in the telegram. Ruth at the stove did not turn around, but her shoulders had a certain quality. Nathan held Clara's gaze. "Both," he said. Clara looked at Grace, then back at Nathan. "I made a promise to Samuel," she said, "and I kept it. I'm not the kind of person who stops making promises just because the last one was hard. She paused. But I'm also not the kind of person who commits to a thing without knowing what the thing is. That's fair, Nathan said. So what is the thing? He was quiet for a moment. Not the avoidant quiet of someone who didn't want to answer, but the careful quiet of someone choosing words that were true. I have a ranch that's been empty for 3 years, he said. I've been maintaining it, going through the motions of a life without the substance of one. He looked at Grace again briefly, then back at Clara. Watching you come up off the ground in that gravel with your fists ready to fight, that did something to me that I haven't been able to undo since. He paused. I don't think I want to undo it. Clara waited. I'm not asking you to stay because you need somewhere to be, he said. I know you don't need saving. You drove 19 days across hard territory alone and pregnant, and you kept your promise, and you sat in a root cellar with a rifle, and you didn't flinch once when it mattered. He held her gaze steadily. I'm asking you to stay because you changed something in my house by being in it, and I'd like to know what that becomes. Clara looked at him for a long time. I have opinions about everything, she said. I know. And I'm not shy about sharing them. Something moved in his face. I gathered. I'll be at that federal hearing and any other hearing they need me at. She paused. I'm not going to pretend to be a woman who stays quietly somewhere while things happen without her. I wouldn't know what to do with a woman like that, Nathan said. Clara looked at Grace one more time. Her daughter, who had come into the world loud and opinionated at 4:17 in the morning, who had been carried here across 300 miles of Montana territory in a locked chest and a broken wagon and a root cellar, and the arms of a man who had stopped on a mountain trail when he could have kept riding. Who had a name now? Grace. I have a sister in Missoula, Clara said slowly. Margaret. She was expecting me. You could write her, Nathan said. I'd need to explain why I'm not coming. What would you tell her? Clara thought about it. I'd tell her that my wagon broke down, she said, and someone stopped to help, and by the time everything was sorted out it seemed reasonable to stay for a while and see what developed. She paused. Margaret is a practical woman. She'll understand practical reasoning. And after a while, Nathan said. After a while, Clara said, we'll see what developed. The kitchen held that for a moment, warm and quiet, the baby asleep and the morning light coming through the window clean and direct after the long night. Ruth put a plate of eggs on the table and said, eat something both of you before you make any more major life decisions. And the ordinary practicality of it broke the tension in the best possible way. And Nathan almost smiled more than he had before, further along the spectrum toward actual. And Clara looked at the eggs and discovered she was hungry in the uncomplicated way of a body that had done something enormous and wanted to be fed. They ate. Bill Carey talked about the summer grazing conditions, which was the topic of a man deliberately giving other people room, and Ruth refilled coffee cups without being asked, and Grace slept through all of it with the absolute indifference of someone who had already made her big entrance and was conserving resources. That afternoon, Hale himself arrived. He came up the South Road unhurried with 2 of his deputies behind him, and he looked like a man who had not slept in 36 hours, and was profoundly satisfied with the reasons why. He came inside and sat at the table and took the coffee Ruth put in front of him, and looked at Clara with the direct gaze she'd come to associate with men who meant what they said. It's done, he said. I know, Clara said. We got your telegram. Blackwell is being transferred to Helena tonight. The preliminary hearing is set for 6 weeks from now. I'll need you there. Your testimony along with Reedy's is the backbone of the case. He paused. I think you should know the families in the Gallatin. We've been out to see them. The Harmon family, the Buckleys, the 3 homesteaders, who were given eviction notices last month. He looked at her steadily. When I told them why the proceedings were stopped, told them what your husband had done, what you'd done to get it here, the Harmon woman cried. Clara pressed her lips together. She doesn't know me, she said. No, Hale said. But she knows what it means to have someone fight for her family when they couldn't fight for themselves. She said to thank you. He paused. I'm passing it along. Clara nodded once, very precisely, the way she did when she was managing something that was trying to get larger than she could contain in a kitchen. "Tell her," Clara said, "that she's welcome, and that her thanks belong equally to my husband, who saw the wrong thing and couldn't walk past it." Hale looked at her. "He would have been proud of you," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "He would have been." She held Hale's gaze. He also would have pointed out in his methodical way that pride was secondary to outcome, and asked for a precise accounting of every charge being filed and the expected timeline for each proceeding. She paused. "I'd like that accounting if you have time." Hale for the first time smiled. A small thing, but real. "I have time," he said. Nathan sat at the edge of the table and listened while Hale and Clara went through the legal proceedings with the focused attention of two people who understood that the work wasn't finished just because the most dramatic part was over. He watched her ask precise questions and push back on vague answers and request clarification on points of territorial law that she had clearly researched, and he thought about what she'd said, that Samuel was methodical, that she was not, that she did things and adjusted as she went. And he thought that wasn't quite right. She was both things. She moved fast and she looked hard, and she had spent 4 months being both at once, and she was still doing it 3 hours after giving birth with a baby asleep in the next room, and the man who'd tried to kill her sitting in a federal jail cell. He thought that he had not in 3 years of deliberate and careful isolation ever met anyone like her. He thought that 3 years was a very long time to keep a door nailed shut. He thought about Grace, the baby's weight in his arms, the small completeness of her, the particular shock of holding something that new and that alive after 3 years of silence. He thought about a boy of 7 who had liked fishing and taken his lessons about hook baiting seriously. He thought that the boy would have liked Grace, would have wanted to hold her too, probably with the serious and slightly terrified care of an older child who understood that babies were fragile and important. Would have asked in that direct and curious way what her name was and why. And Nathan thought for the first time in 3 years that thought without flinching from it. He thought about his son, and it hurt the same way it had always hurt, and he didn't look away from the hurt. He let it exist. And then he looked at Clara across the table, arguing about the timeline for filing motions with a federal marshal with a new baby in the next room and egg on her dress from breakfast. And something that had been living in the very darkest part of his chest shifted, moved, turned its face toward something that felt cautiously and with full awareness of the risk like the future. Hale left before supper. He shook Nathan's hand at the door and said, "You did right by her, by all of them." "She did right by herself," Nathan said. Hale looked at him with a slight expression that suggested he was not going to argue the point, but had opinions about it. "Keep her safe," he said, "until the hearing." "She can keep herself safe," Nathan said, "but I intend to be nearby in case she wants company." Hale nodded once and rode south with his deputies behind him. Nathan stood on the porch until the road was empty again, and then he stood there a little longer, feeling the particular quality of the evening after everything had changed. The light on the mountains, the clean air after 2 days of tension, the knowledge that somewhere in the Gallatin Valley families who didn't know his name were sleeping in their homes tonight because a careful man in spectacles had written down what he saw, and a stubborn woman had carried it 300 miles, and a mountain cowboy had let his horse stop on a trail instead of pushing past. The door opened behind him. Clara came out onto the porch with Grace against her shoulder. The baby awake now, her dark eyes unfocused but tracking the light in the uncanny way of very new people. "She wants to see what all the fuss is about," Clara said. Nathan looked at the baby, then at Clara. "She's going to be like you," he said. "God help everyone," Clara said without missing a beat, and Nathan laughed, a real one, sudden and unguarded, a sound that surprised him almost as much as it surprised her. She looked at him when he laughed, and something in her face went soft for just a moment. The composure she wore like armor, going transparent, and he saw what was underneath it. Not need, not desperation, but something simpler and braver than either. Something that was looking at him with clear eyes, and had been looking at him with clear eyes, since the moment she'd sat across his kitchen table and asked him why he'd really stopped on the trail. "You have a good laugh," she said. "You should use it more." "It's been a while," he said. "Well," she said, "it doesn't seem to have rusted." They stood on the porch together in the evening light, and Grace looked at the mountains with the absolute attention of someone experiencing everything for the first time. And Nathan stood close enough to Clara that he could have reached out and steadied her if she'd needed it, and she didn't need it, but she didn't move away either. And that was the thing, wasn't it? She didn't need it. She was there because she chose to be. And so was he. 6 weeks was both a long time and not nearly long enough. Grace grew the way newborns grew, with a speed that seemed impossible each day, bringing some small change that Clara catalogued with the focused attention of a woman who understood more than most that nothing was guaranteed and everything was worth noticing. The way Grace tracked movement with her eyes by the end of the first week. The way she startled at loud sounds, but not at Nathan's voice, which she seemed to have catalogued early as something that belonged in her world. The way she slept best in the early mornings deeply and completely, as if she had decided that particular part of the day was hers. Clara noticed that Nathan noticed all of it too. He didn't make a show of it. That wasn't his way. But she would catch him watching Grace, with that steady, direct attention he gave to things that mattered to him, and she understood what it cost him and what it meant that he paid it anyway. They settled into the ranch with the careful practicality of two people who were both too honest to pretend the situation was temporary and too cautious to name what it was becoming. Clara moved into the main bedroom. Nathan had offered it without ceremony, relocating himself to the smaller room off the back that had been used for storage, clearing it out one afternoon while she was resting without mentioning he was doing it. She found it done when she woke up, the room clean and empty, a chair placed near the window, and she had gone to find him in the barn to say something and had found him brushing Bessie with the focused calm of a man who was not looking for acknowledgement. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Needed doing," he said. She stood in the barn doorway and looked at him. "Nathan." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. Just that. No elaboration, because he didn't need elaboration, and she had learned that about him, that he heard the full weight of simple words. He nodded once and went back to Bessie, and Clara went back inside, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. The letter from Margaret arrived on the 12th day. Clara had written to her sister the morning after Grace was born. A long letter, the longest she'd written in months, explaining everything. The wagon, Nathan, Hale, Blackwell. The birth. She had not softened any of it, and had not dressed it up, and had told it as plainly as she could, which was the only way she knew how to tell things. Margaret's reply came back faster than the post usually managed. Clara read it at the kitchen table while Nathan was out on the fence line, and Grace was asleep in the basket near the stove, and she read it twice the way she'd read Hale's telegram, and when she set it down, her expression was complicated. Nathan came in an hour later and found her still at the table. "Letter from my sister," Clara said before he could ask. He sat down. "Good news or bad?" "Neither. Both." She looked at the letter. "Margaret wants me to come to Missoula. She says she has room, she has connections, she can help me get established, find work, maybe teaching, she knows the school board." She paused. "She says she's been worried sick, and she wants to see Grace, and she's relieved I'm safe, and she needs me to come." Nathan was quiet. "She's not wrong," Clara said. "Margaret's practical. The offer is real and it's good. Teaching would be steady work. Missoula is a real town with real prospects." She looked at her hands on the table. "A woman alone with a new baby needs prospects." "You're not alone," Nathan said. The words came out quieter than he intended she could tell, and more direct than he'd planned, and he held her gaze when she looked up, not retreating from it. "No," Clara said. "I'm not." She paused. "But we haven't said what that means." "No," he agreed. "We haven't." A silence that had the quality of something that had been patient for a long time and was now declining to be patient any longer. "I've been thinking," Clara said, "about what you said on the porch at the Carey place, that you wanted to see what the thing became." She looked at him steadily. "I want to say something back to that, but I need you to tell me something first. All right?" "When you held Grace that first morning," she said, "what were you thinking?" He looked at her for a moment. "I was thinking about my son," he said. The words were careful and honest. "About Daniel. He was 7 when he died. He was serious about things. Took things seriously that other children let go. I used to tease him that he'd been born 40 years old." Something moved in his face. "I was thinking that he would have wanted to hold Grace, would have asked about her very seriously, made sure he was doing it right." Clara held that carefully. "And what did that feel like?" she said. "Thinking that it hurt," Nathan said. "The same way it always hurts. That didn't change." He paused. "But this time, I didn't look away from it. And when I looked at Grace, I didn't feel—" He stopped choosing the word deliberately. "I didn't feel guilty, for the first time. I looked at something new and good, and I didn't feel like I was betraying the old grief by letting it exist." Clara's eyes were steady on his face. "That's important," she said. "I know, because I need you to understand something about me," Clara said. "I loved Samuel. I will always love Samuel. He was a great man, and he was mine, and Grace carries him in her, and that's not a thing that diminishes with time or with what comes after." She held Nathan's gaze. "But I also believe I have to believe that loving someone well means you don't let what you lost them to be the last word. Samuel spent his last weeks making sure something wrong got made right. He didn't do that, so I would spend the rest of my life in grief. He did that, so I would have something to build on." Nathan was very still. "And you think you can build something here," he said. "I think," Clara said, "that I already have. I just want to make sure we're talking about the same building." Something shifted in Nathan's face finally, after 6 weeks of careful distance and honest proximity. Something came all the way through. "Clara," he said. "Nathan, I want you to stay." The words were plain and direct and entirely without decoration. "Not because you need somewhere to be, not because of Grace, though Grace is." He stopped. "Not only because of Grace. I want you to stay because this house is different with you in it. I'm different with you in it. And I've spent 3 years proving to myself that the absence of difference was survival, and I was wrong, and I'd like to stop being wrong about it." Clara looked at him across the kitchen table. "That's the most words you've said at once since I met you," she said. "It may be the most words I've said at once in 3 years." She almost smiled. The almost was the whole distance. "Write Margaret back," Nathan said. "Tell her you're staying. Tell her she's welcome here whenever she wants to come." "You don't know Margaret," Clara said. "No. She'll come immediately. I have room." Clara looked at her hands, then at Grace in the basket, then at Nathan across the table, with his hands flat on the wood and his eyes steady, and his whole self present in the way she had come to understand was his particular form of courage. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind with speeches and gestures, but the kind that showed up and stayed and didn't look away from hard things. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "I'll write Margaret," she said. "And I'll stay." She paused. "But I want things said plainly between us. I don't want assumptions. I don't want things left in corners to trip over later." "Agreed." "And I'll still be at that federal hearing." "I know." "And I have opinions about how this ranch is run." Something came all the way through into his face. Then the thing she'd been seeing the edges of for 6 weeks, warm and wry and absolutely his. "I know that too," he said. Baisha. The federal hearing was set for a Tuesday in September, 6 weeks and 4 days after Grace was born. Nathan drove them to Helena in the wagon. A sound wagon properly fitted with a seat padded enough for the distance, and Gideon and a borrowed horse pulling easy on the level roads. Grace slept in a basket secured between them for most of the journey, and Clara sat beside Nathan and talked about what she expected from the proceedings, and he listened and asked the occasional precise question, and it was, she thought, a remarkably ordinary thing to be doing, on the way to a federal hearing about a land fraud case that had nearly killed her twice. She said this to Nathan, and he said, "You think ordinary is bad." And she thought about it and said, "No, I think ordinary is exactly what I've been trying to get to." He nodded at that, looking at the road. "Me too," he said. They arrived in Helena the evening before the hearing and took rooms at a boarding house Hale had arranged. Hale met them for supper and went through the proceedings in the careful, organized way he did everything: witness order, documentary evidence, the charges against Blackwell and the 3 county officials, the expected defense strategy. Thomas Reedy was there. Clara had not met him before. He was a slight man in his 40s with careful eyes and the precise economical movements of someone who had spent 8 months in hiding and had not yet entirely relaxed out of it. He stood when Clara came into the room and looked at her for a moment before speaking. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I knew your husband. Not well, we only worked the Gallatin survey together for 3 weeks, but I knew him." He paused. "He was the best surveyor I ever worked with. Not just technically. He paid attention to what the land was actually saying, not just what he'd been hired to record." Clara held out her hand, and Reedy shook it. "He told me about you," she said. "He said you had the sharpest eye for boundary anomalies he'd ever seen." Reedy looked startled. "He said that—" "He wrote it down," Clara said. "In the logbook. I brought it." She paused. "I thought you'd want to know he said it." Reedy looked at her for a moment with an expression that was doing several things at once. "Thank you," he said. They sat down to supper, and for the first time in 4 months, Clara was in a room where everyone knew what had happened and what was at stake, and nobody needed anything explained, and she could simply be a person eating supper before an important day. And she felt something in her shoulders that had been held rigid for so long she'd forgotten it was rigid, slowly, cautiously begin to release. The hearing lasted 2 days. Clara testified for 3 hours on the first day. She had prepared. Of course she had prepared. She had spent 6 weeks in a ranch kitchen with Samuel's logbook and the chest documents memorized to the page, and she answered every question directly and precisely the way Samuel would have approved of, and the way that left no room for the defense attorney to find gaps. The defense attorney tried anyway. He was a city man, expensive suit, with the particular brand of condescension that manifested as excessive politeness toward women he was trying to undermine. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said in the careful tone of a man who thought he was setting a trap, "you were traveling alone, pregnant, under considerable stress. Is it possible that your reading of your late husband's documents was influenced by grief? By a widow's desire to find meaning in a loss?" Clara looked at him. "My husband was a surveyor for 16 years, she said. "His measurements were legally admissible in territorial court before he died. His documentation methods were considered exemplary by the Territorial Land Office, which I can demonstrate with correspondence I have on record." She paused. "Are you suggesting that his professional competence changed because his wife is grieving?" A short silence in the courtroom. "No," the attorney said carefully. "Then the grief is irrelevant to the accuracy of the documents," Clara said. "Shall we continue?" Nathan in the gallery behind her said nothing, but she heard in the quality of the silence from his direction something that she thought was very close to pride. The documents spoke for themselves. Samuel's careful handwriting, his precise measurements, his red ink notations on the forged records. Reedy's testimony corroborated at every point. The payment ledger entries that connected Blackwell directly to the falsified deeds. Hale's 14 months of exterior investigation, now fully supported by the interior evidence that had been locked in an iron-banded chest through a Montana summer. By the end of the second day, there was nothing left to argue. Victor Blackwell was convicted on 7 counts of land fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy, and 1 count of obstruction of federal law enforcement. The 3 county officials pled guilty in exchange for reduced sentences. The land claims in the Gallatin Valley were formally restored to their original holders. The development company's assets were frozen pending civil proceedings by the displaced families. Hale shook Clara's hand outside the courthouse. "Samuel Whitmore's evidence was the backbone of every count," he said. "I want that on record with you, Mrs. Whitmore. What he collected and what you carried here made this possible. The families in the Gallatin know it. The court knows it. And I know it." Clara nodded. "Make sure the record reflects it," she said. Not for me. For Grace. When she's old enough to understand what her father did. It will, Hale said. I'll see to it personally. He tipped his hat and walked back up the courthouse steps, and Clara stood on the street in Helena, with the September sun on her face, and Nathan beside her, and Grace against her shoulder, and let herself feel fully, and without reservation, the weight of what had been accomplished. Samuel's promise. Kept. His work. Completed. His name. On the record. She pressed her cheek to Grace's head. Your father did this, she said quietly. All of it. Remember that. Nathan's hand came to rest against the small of her back, steady and light. Not demanding attention, not requiring a response. Just there. She leaned into it slightly. He didn't move away. They were a week back from Helena when Margaret arrived. Clara had warned him. He had said he had room. He had underestimated Margaret, who arrived with 2 trunks, a crate of books, strong opinions about kitchen organization, and an 18-month-old son named Peter, who immediately began investigating every corner of the ranch with the systematic thoroughness of a born explorer. Nathan stood in the yard and watched Peter attempt to make friends with Gideon through the fence rail, and Margaret stood beside Clara and looked at Nathan for a long assessing moment that Clara recognized as the Margaret Whitmore version of taking someone's full measure. He's taller than I expected, Margaret said. He's exactly the height he is, Clara said. You know what I mean. I know what you mean, and I'm ignoring it. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then, he looks at you like you're something he didn't know he was looking for. Clara watched Nathan crouch down to help Peter reach through the fence rail to touch Gideon's nose, carefully, patiently, one hand steadying the boy's reach. I know, she said softly. And you, Margaret said. Clara watched Nathan help Peter and thought about a mountain trail in summer and a broken wagon and a man who'd taken off his hat and said, I'm not here to hurt you, and everything that had followed from that simple, honest act. She thought about Samuel, who had seen something wrong and written it down, whose careful handwriting was now part of a federal court record, whose daughter had his dark hair and his absolute concentration and his refusal to be rushed. She thought about what it meant to survive the worst thing and still be standing, and to look across a kitchen table at someone else who had survived theirs, and to choose deliberately and with full knowledge of the cost to care again. He's a good man, Clara said. That's not what I asked. I know, Clara smiled. Yes, and me. Margaret let out a breath and put her arm around Clara's shoulders briefly, and they stood there for a moment, watching Nathan Cole carefully teach an 18-month-old boy how to greet a horse without startling it, and Grace slept in her basket on the porch behind them, and the afternoon light came down through the pines the way it did in September, golden and exact. That evening after supper, after Margaret had taken Peter to bed, and the house had gone quiet with the particular quality of a house that had people sleeping in it, Nathan and Clara sat on the porch. Grace was asleep inside. The night was clear, the kind of clear that only came after the summer heat broke, with the stars extraordinarily precise and the air carrying the first edge of fall. Thank you, Clara said, for being patient with Peter. He's a good boy, Nathan said. Curious. Aggressively curious, Clara said. He's been that way since he could walk. She paused. Margaret's husband died 2 years ago. She's been managing alone. She manages well, Nathan said. She always has. Clara looked at the stars. She was the one who told me after I lost Lily that grief didn't mean you stopped. She said you carry it and you keep moving, and eventually the carrying gets easier, not because the weight changes, but because you get stronger. She paused. I thought she was being practical to the point of coldness at the time. And now I think she was right, and I think it takes something as real as what you've been carrying to know that. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Daniel would have been 10 this year, he said. Clara turned her head to look at him. October, he said. His birthday was in October. He paused. He liked rocks, collecting them. He had a whole shelf of them organized in a system only he understood. Something in his voice was both tender and steady. I kept the shelf. I don't know why. I just couldn't take it down. Don't, Clara said. Don't take it down. He looked at her. Grace should know about him, Clara said. When she's old enough. She should know there was a boy named Daniel who organized rocks on a shelf and took fishing very seriously, and would have held her carefully and asked all the right questions. She held Nathan's gaze. She should know that the man who helped bring her safely into the world had loved people before her, and the loving didn't stop when he lost them. It became part of what made him the person who stopped on the trail. Nathan's jaw worked slightly. You say things, he said, very directly. Samuel always said I had no instinct for the gentle approach. I didn't say it was a problem. He looked at her. I'm not used to it, but I didn't say it was a problem. Good, Clara said, because I don't expect to develop one. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out slowly and covered her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair with his. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and she turned her palm up and let him hold it, and they sat like that without speaking while the night settled into itself around them. I think we ought to get married, Nathan said. Clara blinked. That wasn't a question, she said. I know. He looked at her steadily. I'm telling you what I think we ought to do. The question is whether you agree. You're asking me if I agree with your statement. Yes. That's a very particular way of proposing, Clara said. I'm a particular person. She looked at him. Looked at their hands together. Looked at the dark mountains beyond the ranch fence. The same mountains that had been unforgiving last summer and were lit silver tonight in the September starlight, indifferent as always to the small human dramas playing out beneath them. She thought about how she'd come off that trail, broken wagon, spent horse, bleeding palms, a dead man's promise locked in a chest, a baby on the way. Nothing she could be certain of except that she was going to keep moving because stopping was not something she was built for. And a man had taken off his hat and said, I'm not here to hurt you. And he never had been. And he never would be. Yes, Clara said. I agree. Nathan's hand tightened on hers, not dramatically. Not with a speech or a gesture. Just a steady present, tightening the physical language of a man who had learned to say the important things with his whole self rather than just his words. Good, he said. I'll want a proper ceremony, Clara said. Margaret will have opinions. I reckoned. And I want Hale there, and the Careys. And I want Samuel's name said. I want it part of the ceremony. Not as an obstacle or an absence, but as part of the story that got us here. Of course, Nathan said, without hesitation, like it was the only answer there was, and that Clara thought was the thing. That immediate of course without reservation, without the need to consider whether it was comfortable or complicated. He understood that her whole life was the story that had gotten her here, the same way his whole life was the story that had brought him to a mountain trail on the right afternoon in the right season to let a horse named Gideon stop. Nothing erased, nothing diminished. Everything carried forward. Grace woke inside and announced herself with the particular indignant cry of someone who had decided the night's sleeping was done. Clara started to rise, and Nathan was already up, already moving toward the door, already going to get her. Clara sat back and listened to his voice through the door, low and quiet and completely steady, the voice she had watched Grace learn to recognize in her first days of life, and heard her daughter's crying slow and settle into the wordless, satisfied sounds of a baby being held by someone who held her like she mattered. Which she did. They both did. All of them did. When Nathan came back out with Grace against his shoulder and the baby's dark eyes searching the night sky with the absolute serious focus she'd been born with, Clara looked at them both and felt something she had not felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what to call it. She was home. Not the home she'd planned, not the home she'd started toward. Not any home she could have described at the beginning of this long summer of broken wagons and dangerous trails and dead men's promises. But home in the truest sense, The place where the people she loved were, where she was known completely and wanted anyway. Where the grief she carried and the courage it had taken to carry it were both part of the story and not required to be hidden. Nathan sat back down beside her. Grace wide awake and watching the stars, his shoulder against hers. "She's counting them," Clara said. "How many do you think she's got so far?" "All of them," Clara said. "She doesn't do anything by halves." Nathan looked at Grace and then at Clara, and Clara felt the weight and the warmth of his look, the way she'd felt his hand on hers, steady, present entirely without pretense. "No," he said, "she doesn't." And because some things didn't need more words than that, they sat together on the porch of a Montana ranch in the September starlight. A man who had stopped running from hope, and a woman who had never stopped running toward it with a baby between them, who had arrived in the world loud and certain and ready. And the mountains rose around them the same as always, unforgiving and magnificent, and the life they were choosing, not the easy one, not the simple one, but the real one, the full one, the one that held loss and love in the same two hands, had already without ceremony, without announcement already and completely begun.